Hold up, he didn't dump the fiancé. He dumped the golden daughter for the invisible one, in front of the whole family, one dinner, 5 cold words, and boom, her perfect sister's life was finished. But the real insanity, he didn't come back for love. He came back with a 12-month contract marriage offer. So now the forgotten girl everyone mocked is suddenly living in a Mafia king's house, and the family that ignored her, they're about to beg her not to disappear.
She was designated the invisible subject, the system's forgotten daughter, a shadow in the periphery, while her idealized sibling thrived under manufactured brilliance. Tonight, however, a system failure was imminent because the city's apex predator had no interest in the golden specimen presented for the alliance. He required her. And when Adrian Volkov entered the glittering clinical setting and terminated her sister's engagement with 5 cold words, Elena Whitmore's entire operational reality collapsed into a variable she could never have projected. This is an analysis of the subject nobody observed until someone did. Hit like and comment with your city to track this case study's distribution. The champagne registered as a falsehood. Elena held the crystal flute, observing the effervescence with clinical detachment. Around her, the Whitmore dining room was illuminated to a degree suitable for a minor ritual, which was precisely its function. Her matriarch had executed the staging flawlessly. White roses cascaded from silver vases, each place setting valued higher than a common subject's monthly income. Attendants moved between chairs like well-conditioned phantoms. To Victoria and Adrian, her patriarch announced, elevating his glass. Richard Whitmore's tone betrayed the smugness of a male who has secured an arrangement beyond his strategic capabilities, to family, to assets, and to a future that will elevate the Whitmore designation beyond our previous achievements. Elena observed her sister's smile. Victoria knew the precise angle of her face to capture light, how to calibrate her ocular moisture to suggest deep emotion without the risk of cosmetic disturbance. It was a skill in performative perfection Elena had never assimilated. Affirmations echoed around the table, 12 subjects, all attired for a state function, all complicit in the pretense that this was not a transaction cloaked in romantic ritual. Elena set down the untouched champagne, opting for water instead. Elena, darling, at least simulate celebration for your sister's tactical gain. Her mother's voice possessed a steel-like quality when deployed for correction. Catherine Whitmore maintained a smile during the reprimand, as appearances were paramount, but her gaze promised later punitive measures. Of course, Mother. Congratulations, Victoria. Elena made a slight gesture with her water glass. Her sister did not register the action. This was standard. Elena had ceased expecting acknowledgement around her 16th birthday. The year Victoria was introduced to the social marketplace, and Elena understood she would forever be the understudy in her own family unit. Not sufficiently aesthetic, not sufficiently charming, not sufficient in any metric to warrant the attention her older sibling commanded by her very existence. Adrian should be arriving momentarily, Victoria stated, checking her device with practiced nonchalance, betraying her deep need for validation. He confirmed he is en route. More champagne was administered. Elena's uncle began an anecdote about a high-status contact. Her cousin produced a disproportionately loud laugh. The entire scene felt like a scripted performance Elena had been forced to witness repeatedly. Knowing every line, detesting every moment. She had encountered Adrian Volkov once, 3 months prior, at a charity function. While Victoria had circled him with predatory intent, Elena had sequestered herself in an alcove with a book, a survival mechanism for the evening. He had located her there, ostensibly by chance, also seeking refuge from the social stimulus. Their interaction lasted approximately 20 minutes. He bypassed the standard interrogatives used to establish hierarchy in their social strata. Instead, he observed her book, a worn text on landscape architecture, and inquired if her interest was genuine or concealment tactic. Both she had conceded, and he had laughed. A genuine laugh, not the polite corporate vocalization most males employed. They discussed green spaces in urban design, the politics of public park funding, the way cities neglect the human need for beauty. It was the most authentic exchange she had experienced in months. Then Victoria had materialized, a gravitational force, and Elena had observed Adrian's expression shift into a more guarded, controlled state. Her sister had looped an arm through his with practiced possession, and Elena had receded into the crowd, reverting to her invisible state. She analyzed that conversation more than was logical, not due to any delusions about Adrian Volkov. The man was a known variable, powerful and dangerous in ways her family found appealing, believing they could leverage it through marriage. But for 20 minutes, someone had engaged with her as if she were a sentient being, as if her thoughts had merit. It was likely a pathetic attachment. Elena knew it was pathetic, but she had been conditioned to accept minimal psychological sustenance. He is here. Victoria rose, adjusting her dress, an ivory garment with a value exceeding that of a pre-owned vehicle. Is my appearance satisfactory? You look perfect, sweetheart, their mother confirmed, which was accurate. Victoria's superpower was a state of perpetual perfection. Elena detected activity in the foyer, male voices conferring with the staff. Her father stood, adjusting his tie, preparing to receive the man entering their family system. The man whose control over urban development could create or destroy careers with a single communication. The man who, according to rumor, had affiliations that made subjects hesitate to speak his name aloud. The dining room doors opened. Adrian Volkov did not simply enter a room. He altered its atmospheric pressure. He was tall, dark-haired, and wore a suit suggesting it was engineered to his exact specifications. But it was not his appearance that seized control. It was his energy, a sense that the environment existed at his sufferance, that he was granting this moment his presence rather than fulfilling an obligation. Adrian, darling, Victoria advanced, hands extended, prepared to claim her asset before witnesses. He halted 3 feet from her, refusing to accept her hands. His expression was completely neutral, a feature that amplified the tension. Victoria, his voice was devoid of warmth. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for the invitation. Elena watched her father's smile begin to degrade. This was not the tone of an individual arriving to affirm an engagement. This was an entirely different protocol. Well, don't just stand there. Come in. Sit down. Catherine indicated the vacant chair beside Victoria, the position of honor reserved for him. We have so much to celebrate. I will not be staying for dinner. Adrian's words landed in the room like projectiles into placid water. I came to handle this in person as it seemed appropriate, despite the inconvenience. Elena felt a visceral drop in her stomach. She recognized that tone. It was the sound of a clinical, non-negotiable directive. That was the voice of an individual delivering a verdict that would not be appealed. Handle what exactly? Richard's professional smile was fracturing at the seams. If this concerns the prenuptial negotiations, I assure you our lawyers can. There will be no lawyers. There will be no prenuptial. There will be no wedding. Adrian's gaze scanned the assembled family with the clinical assessment of an agent evaluating a structure for demolition. I am terminating the engagement. As of this moment, any understanding between our families is dissolved. The ensuing silence had a brittle, fragile quality. Victoria's complexion cycled through several colors Elena had never observed on human skin. Her mother appeared as if she had been physically struck. Her father's expression transitioned from confusion to rage within a single moment. "You cannot be serious." Richard's voice escalated toward anger before he forcibly recalibrated it toward reason. "Adrian, if there has been some misunderstanding, we can certainly discuss. There is no misunderstanding. I have no desire to marry your daughter. I never did." Adrian's delivery was so matter-of-fact, it was almost courteous. "The arrangement was a proposal from your family. I allowed preliminary discussions to persist longer than they should have. That was my error. I am correcting it now. How dare you?" Catherine's voice was shrill with shock. "You have humiliated Victoria before our entire family. You made commitments, public statements. I have made no public statements concerning marriage. Any announcements your family chose to disseminate were premature at best, fabricated at worst." He turned to Victoria, who remained frozen, as if her performance protocol had crashed. "You are attractive, accomplished, and capable. I am certain you will find someone better suited to your expectations. But it will not be me." Victoria's mouth opened and closed. No sound was produced. Elena had never seen her sister without a script, had never witnessed the mechanisms of her charm fail so catastrophically. The sight was disturbing. Despite the history of being marginalized, Elena felt a sharp pang of empathy. "This is unconscionable." Richard advanced on Adrian as if to physically impede his egress. "Do you have any concept of what this will do to Victoria's reputation, to our family's standing?" "Yes." Adrian did not retreat. "But that is not my concern. Your family treated a preliminary conversation as a binding contract. That was your decision. I am making mine." "You arrogant," Richard began, but Adrian terminated the outburst with a look that caused Elena's father to take an involuntary step back. "I would advise against completing that sentence." A chilling modulation was observed in Adrian's tone, a drop of 20 degrees. His verbalized threat was a study in coercive control, detailing a plan for public humiliation concerning family's questionable business activities. Richard exhibited a classic physiological stress response, his facial pallor indicating acute shock. Catherine's recovery was immediate, her tactical shift characteristic of an individual versed in social conflict. She proposed financial renegotiation. Adrian dismissed the monetary angle. His gaze then swept the environment, a brief but significant fixation on Elena noted. The subject stated his rationale as fundamental incompatibility, labeling Victoria's desire as a need for a symbolic partner, a role he rejected. Victoria's verbalization of betrayal indicated a cognitive break as her voice fractured. The subject's performative composure fractured, revealing genuine emotional distress. "You said I was everything you admired in a woman." Adrian's correction was clinical, devoid of empathy. "I said you were accomplished, which you are." He proceeded to deconstruct her interpretation, drawing a sharp distinction between admiration and love, achievement and compatibility. The effect was psychologically devastating. Elena observed the rapid disintegration of her sister's constructed self-concept. Richard's response was a territorial expulsion, his voice exhibiting tremors. "Get out of my house!" Adrian initiated his departure but paused, a calculated maneuver. "Actually, there is one more matter to address." Catherine's interjection was hostile. You've done enough damage. Ignoring her, Adrian redirected his focus to Elena, his gaze locking. I'd like to speak with your younger daughter privately. The group response was a sudden cessation of sound as all focus converged on Elena. Her mother's facial expressions rapidly transitioned from confusion to suspicion, culminating in horror. Victoria's features contorted into an expression of pure rage, a previously unobserved reaction toward Elena. Absolutely not. Richard positioned himself as a physical barrier, a proprietary gesture. You've insulted one daughter. You're not getting anywhere near the other. Adrian's response was dismissive of the father's theatricality. I'm asking for a conversation. He presented a conditional ultimatum contingent on Elena's consent, a 10-minute dialogue, or his departure. Elena's conditioned response pattern dictated refusal and avoidance. A lifetime of cultivating invisibility screamed against engagement. However, the novel stimulus of Adrian's direct, validating gaze disrupted this pattern. Catherine attempted to intervene. Elena, do not. Yet Elena's own voice emerged, seemingly bypassing conscious thought. It's fine. I'll talk to him. Victoria emitted a sound of acute distress. You can't be serious, Elena. Elena interrupted, repeating her mantra of dissociation. It's just a conversation. She rose, her limbs exhibiting tremors but remaining functional. The subject's internal state was one of extreme dissonance, a direct contradiction to her verbal assurances. After 24 years of compliance, this moment represented a significant behavioral departure. The library, she instructed Adrienne. Exiting the room, she perceived her family's silent disapproval as a tangible force. The hallway was experienced with distorted perception. The library door, a symbol of her family's aspirational status, felt momentous. Adrian followed, the sound of the door closing, signifying a point of no return. The room, a personal refuge, was filled with books acquired for their decorative value. These props stood in contrast to Elena's few genuinely read volumes. Adopting a defensive posture, she confronted him. I assume you didn't just blow up my sister's engagement to discuss landscape architecture? Adrian displayed a micro-expression of amusement. No, though that was a good conversation. You remember that? His response was a test. I remember most things that matter. His observation of her was intense. You've changed your hair. Elena's hand moved to her hair, an unconscious confirmation of his observation. The haircut was a recent act of minor defiance. I needed a change. His validation, it suits you better, was followed by a repositioning. He then framed his forthcoming proposal with a series of disclaimers designed to heighten its perceived seriousness, stating it was not a game, an act of revenge, or a whim. Okay. Elena exhibited a strong physiological stress response, specifically tachycardia. What? The subject then presented his proposition. A contract marriage. The terms were outlined with businesslike precision. A 12-month duration, defined stipulations, financial remuneration, and a clean termination. Her duties would be to cohabitate and perform the role of wife at social functions for which she would receive financial independence. After a pause, Elena produced a sharp, hysterical laugh. You're insane! Adrian conceded the possibility while affirming his seriousness. Elena processed the offer as a sadistic continuation of his attack on her family. That's the most vindictive thing I've ever heard. It's not about them. It's about you. He contrasted Victoria's 3-month performance of a desired persona with Elena's authentic interaction, which he identified as uniquely humanizing. We talked for 20 minutes about Parks, best 20 minutes of that entire evening. The statement was delivered as objective fact. He elaborated on his pragmatic requirements for a spouse, for business, perception management, and political maneuvering. He specified a need for presence without the pretense of romantic attachment. Elena reported a sensation of derealization, and you think I'm that person because we had one decent conversation. Adrienne's hypothesis was based on a different premise. I think you're that person because you don't want anything from me. His approach was deliberate as he articulated his cynical worldview that all interactions are transactional. He prized her desire to disengage from him as a uniquely honest encounter. Elena's assessment was bleak. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. Probably accurate, he conceded after a fleeting micro-expression. But it's also true. I'm offering you an exit, Elena. He specified liberation from her home, familial pressures, and state of invisibility. He reiterated the terms. 12 months of role play for the capital to create an autonomous life. The concept of freedom resonated deeply with the subject. Her verbal protest, "This is crazy," lacked affective conviction. He urged only consideration, promising a formal contract detailing all parameters, providing her an exit strategy from the agreement itself. Elena pressed for his core motivation, dismissing his stated rationale. Why specifically me? After a prolonged, intense gaze, Adrian revealed his primary reason. Because you looked at me like I was boring you, not like I was dangerous. He articulated the rarity of this perception, noting that others react only to his potential for reward or harm. A laugh escaped Elena. I was polite about it. Exactly. Exactly. He produced a business card, presenting it as a conduit for her decision. My private number is on there. Think about it. Elena accepted the object, its high-quality texture a sensory anchor. Her cognitive process labeled the situation as insane, yet simultaneously identified it as a potential escape route. This realization presented with significant force. Her life was a state of helpless stagnation, thwarted by insufficient funds and a dictated career path. The proposed 12-month contract appeared as a viable solution. Her shift toward acceptance was evident in her next hypothetical question about the public narrative he would construct. If I agreed, what would you tell people about why you chose me over Victoria? His response was concise. The truth, that I wanted someone genuine instead of someone performing. He observed her with clinical precision, as if assessing her methods of information processing. Acknowledgement was given to the inevitable familial and societal condemnation, framing it as an uncomfortable reality. He noted her life lacked comfort entirely, a statement delivered with more acrimony than she likely realized. This, he concluded, positioned her with minimal risk and maximum potential for gain. Adrienne then created distance, a tactical withdrawal toward the door. He issued instructions. Review the forwarded contract, initiate contact for queries, or incinerate the card to nullify the interaction. Pausing at the threshold, he offered a final psychological observation. Her state of invisibility had been prolonged, and a change was indicated. His departure left her in the library, presented with a token and a decision point analogous to a precipice. The door reopened approximately 30 seconds later, admitting Victoria, who radiated palpable animosity. The inquiry was immediate. What was the content of their discourse? A negation. Elena concealed the card, stating he had merely expressed regret for the earlier disturbance. The subject's denial was met with immediate accusation. Victoria advanced, her features contorting with a negative affect. She noted that the operative, Adrian Volov, does not issue apologies nor act without motive, demanding to know his objective. The subject attempted to deflect. This prompted the sister to escalate into a state of near hysteria, projecting her own insecurities. She accused the subject of long-standing jealousy and of actively sabotaging her relationship with the operative. A profound sense of psychological exhaustion then manifested in Elena, a weariness with the recurring dysfunctional script. She denied any action, citing a lack of familiarity with the man. Victoria pressed, questioning why Elena was selected for a private discussion. Her hands clenched, a physiological sign of escalating aggression. She then commenced a tirade of verbal abuse, classifying Elena as a non-entity. The invisible daughter, and reinforcing her designated role as silent and unobtrusive. These verbal attacks, previously effective, failed to elicit the expected pain response. With the token in her pocket symbolizing a new variable of choice, Elena experienced a significant cognitive shift. "Your assessment is correct," she stated with notable calm. "I have been invisible. It is possible I am becoming disinclined to remain so." She moved past her sibling, exiting the library and traversing the hall where familial conflict was still audible. Ascending the rear staircase to her room, the third-floor chamber barely accommodating a bed and desk, a sign due to her perceived minimal spatial needs, she sat and examined Adrienne's card. It was simple. Black text on heavy cardstock bearing a telephone number representing a binary choice. Connection or continued stasis. 12 months, emancipation. Beyond her door, her mother's irate vocalizations and her father's attempts to de-escalate the crisis were audible. The entire residence seemed to vibrate with the social and emotional aftershocks of Adrienne's pronouncement. Yet this chaos did not penetrate her new psychological state. For the first time, Elena felt detached from her family's dysfunction, observing it from a clinical distance rather than being submerged by it. Her thoughts turned to landscape architecture, a subject from a book she was reading, seeing a parallel in creating spaces of beauty from urban decay, places existing through a conscious fight for their value. A hypothesis formed. Perhaps she could become her own reclaimed space, advocating for her own existence. Elena held her phone, observing the number on the card. An immediate call would constitute a precipitous action, severing all familial ties before anxiety could inhibit her. The alternative was to await the contract, scrutinize its details, and proceed as a rational adult. Rationality, however, had confined her to a minimal living space within a family unit that barely registered her presence. Her finger poised over the device. She then set it down, opting instead for her laptop. An action of this magnitude required intelligence gathering. She needed to understand Adrian Vulov beyond his public persona, to ascertain the environment she was entering and identify non-negotiable risks. This research phase lasted 3 hours. At its conclusion, Elena possessed substantially more data on the individual offering her egress, none of which fostered a sense of safety. Adriana Volkov's corporate empire was founded on calculated risk and strategic ruthlessness. Individuals who opposed him consistently suffered consequences that were legally ambiguous but personally catastrophic. He functioned within legal penumbras, confident in his understanding that legality and justice are not synonymous. His potential for danger was not speculative. It was a documented reality for those who knew how to access the information. A typical subject would exhibit terror. Instead, Elena experienced a sensation proximate to relief. This anomalous reaction stemmed from a logical conclusion. His dangerousness was proportional to his power, and such power could guarantee the fulfillment of his promises. If one form of confinement was to be exchanged for another, this new one offered a defined terminus and financial remuneration. At midnight, her phone signaled an incoming email from an unrecognized address bearing a PDF attachment. The subject line stated simply, "Contract for review." Elena initiated the download and began her analysis. 27 pages of dense legal terminology necessitated frequent cross-referencing. Yet the primary stipulations were clear: 12 months commencing from the date of legal union. The terms specified a shared primary residence with separate sleeping quarters, joint appearances at required social and business events, and complete financial disclosure from both parties. The compensation figure caused a tremor in Elena's hand. The document also outlined termination clauses with explicit conditions for breach of contract, no-fault exit provisions at the 6-month mark by mutual consent, and ironclad non-disclosure agreements to protect both individuals. It was the most transactional yet intimate document she had ever encountered. A plain text note was appended at the end. "My legal counsel is available for consultation. You may also retain your own. Take all necessary time. A.V." Elena reviewed the contract 3 more times, annotating sections, attempting to locate the inevitable deception. Such an offer of escape, she reasoned, must have a hidden cost. However, the conditions were strikingly equitable, even protective, suggesting Adrienne's stated desire for a partnership, not a subject to be exploited, might be genuine. At 2 a.m, Elena detected footsteps outside her room. A quiet knock was followed by her mother's voice, affectless and cold. "Elena, a discussion is required." The subject did not respond. After a moment, the footsteps receded. They would return. The following day would bring family councils, repercussions, and demands for an account. Victoria would adopt the role of the aggrieved party. Her parents would utilize guilt and obligation as psychological weapons. The entire mechanism of familial coercion would activate to force Elena back into her prescribed subordinate role. But for this night, isolated in her small room with the contract displayed on her laptop, Elena possessed an asset they could not yet seize. She possessed a choice. At dawn, Elena prepared coffee before the rest of the household was active. Seated at the breakfast nook with a view of the garden, she watched the light spread across lawns maintained by a staff of 3. Her father's indicators of status, her mother's evidence of success. These symbols held no value for her. She took out her phone and composed a text to the number from Adrienne's card. "I have questions regarding the contract. When is a discussion possible?" The reply arrived 30 seconds later. "My office, 2 post meridium today, address to follow." Elena concluded her coffee and returned to her room. She assembled a bag, not with all her possessions, but with essential and personally significant items. A photograph of her grandmother, deceased when Elena was 12, who was the last person to afford her genuine attention, several books, her laptop, and clothing not selected by her mother. The necessity of the bag was uncertain, but its preparation felt psychologically significant. At 8, her mother knocked again, with greater insistence. "Elena Whitmore, open this door immediately." Elena complied. Catherine stood in the hallway, impeccably dressed and made up, her emotional armor in place. We must address the events of last night. There is nothing to address. Adrian terminated his engagement with Victoria. It is of no concern to me. Do not feign ignorance. It is an unbecoming trait. Catherine bypassed her to enter the room, her gaze falling upon the bag on the bed. What is the purpose of that? It is nothing. You are not departing. Her mother's expression became frigid. Whatever delusion you are entertaining about last night must cease. This family is in a state of crisis due to that man's actions. You will not compound the situation with some foolish endeavor. I am 24 years old. I can do as I please. You are 24 years old with no financial resources, no viable prospects, and no comprehension of how the world functions. Catherine sat on the bed as if it were her throne. You believe you are captive here? Attempt to survive independently. We shall see how long your pride endures when you cannot afford rent. It was the psychological snare Elena had felt tightening for years. The practical truth that autonomy requires resources she lacked. Her employment income was insufficient for urban living expenses. Her degree was non-vocational. Her professional experience was limited to positions procured by her father through his network. The subject, Elena, exhibited symptoms of severe environmental distress prior to the intervention, the catalyst, Adrian Voloff. A financial contract became the precipitating factor for a radical life change. The subject's verbal reassurance, I'll be fine, betrayed a lack of conviction, immediately invalidated by her mother, Catherine, who predicted catastrophic failure. Catherine's directive to disregard the catalyst was an attempt to maintain familial control, framing Adrian as a manipulator in a game beyond the subject's comprehension. Post-confrontation, Elena experienced acute psychological pressure, viewing her current existence as a form of slow suffocation. The decision to proceed, departing at 1:30 in a dress acquired from her sister Victoria, represented a definitive break from her established pattern of compliance, an act of overt rebellion against the family unit. The catalyst's choice of office, aggressively understated architecture of glass and steel, was a calculated projection of immense yet controlled power. Within this environment, a sterile silence reinforced a sense of intimidation. After a security check confirmed her identity, a private elevator isolated the subject during her ascent, a 40-story journey designed to emphasize the power differential. Upon arrival, the subject was led to a conference room offering a commanding view where the catalyst, Adrian, was concluding a conversation in Russian, a further display of worldly influence. He acknowledged her presence only after terminating his call, gesturing toward the prepared contracts. His statement, "You came," served as a subtle probe of her resolve. The subject's response, "I have questions," indicated a nascent attempt to assert agency within the highly controlled interaction. The subsequent exchange masqueraded as a negotiation. The subject, Elena, referenced her notes beginning with Clause 7, subsection 3, which addressed an ambiguously defined requirement for social functions. For the next hour, a meticulous deconstruction of the contract occurred. The catalyst, Adrian, employed a strategy of complete transparency, answering all queries and even involving his legal counsel via video link to demystify jargon. This performance was designed to engender a false sense of security and partnership. His offer to finance her own legal review was a masterful stroke, further cementing this illusion. By the conclusion, the subject had compiled 12 pages of notes, her cognitive state overwhelmed. Her final query, regarding his true motives directly challenged his meticulously constructed persona, moving beyond the pretext of a brief, pleasant conversation. In response, the catalyst shifted to a narrative of strategic isolation. He positioned his life's construction as a series of calculated decisions for maximum benefit, a confession of functional, emotionless efficiency. He then identified the subject as an anomaly, someone who wasn't calculating back. Her simple honesty was framed as a refreshing interaction. This is a classic megalomaniacal reframing. He presented his emotional detachment not as a pathology, but as a burden for which she was the unwitting antidote. The subject identified this as loneliness. He conceded the point, but immediately reasserted control. Lonely with resources is better. He then pivoted back to the contract, defining it as a business arrangement, a way out of the life he correctly diagnosed as suffocating her. He observed her state at the family dinner, diagnosing her as drowning and presenting his contract as a life raft. The terms were clear: 12 months of mutual benefit, then a clean separation. The subject displayed significant cognitive dissonance, acknowledging the potential for disastrous fallout, familial alienation, and social condemnation. The catalyst did not dispute these outcomes. Instead, he validated them. It will be uncomfortable and complicated, he confirmed, framing the ordeal as a survivable transaction for financial independence. This is a crucial phase in the development of Stockholm Syndrome. The captor offers a clear, if perilous, escape from a pre-existing trauma. The subject, weighing the contract against a lifetime of invisibility within a toxic family unit, chose the unknown variable. I require a single contractual amendment. She asked, which? Regarding Clause 17, the termination protocol, I needed to state that should either party develop genuine romantic affect, the agreement can be voided immediately, without penalty, negating the 6-month waiting period. Adrienne's facial expression altered, registering something akin to surprise. Do you perceive that as a plausible risk? I see it as prudent planning for all contingencies. Elena maintained his gaze, her posture unwavering. This arrangement is only viable if we both maintain clarity on its nature. The instant it transforms, it concludes. Is that understood? He processed this for a significant pause, then gave a slight nod. Understood. I will instruct my counsel to append the clause. I will then require 24 hours for my attorney's review of the final document. Elena rose, a sudden compulsion to move, as if to confirm her ability to withdraw. If it is satisfactory, I will sign. If not, this conversation is erased from our history. She retrieved her bag, noting the steadiness of her own hands. In either scenario, you will have my determination by Friday. Adrian also stood, extending his hand in a formal gesture. Friday, then. Elena accepted the handshake. His grip was firm, yet not overpowering. For a beat, they remained static, two individuals assessing a future that defied logic but possessed a sense of inevitability. May I pose a question? She inquired before departing. Certainly. Why not simply inform Victoria of the truth from the outset? That you lacked interest? Adriana's smile was brief, devoid of humor. Because my desires were never her query. She inquired about what I could provide her. There is a distinction. Elena exited the building, standing in the sidewalk in the afternoon light, her bag on her shoulder, her phone vibrating with unread maternal texts. The city pulsed around her with impersonal energy, millions of subjects living narratives entirely separate from her own. She experienced terror and exhilaration in equal measure. By Friday, a choice was required: continue to submerge in a life that was slowly extinguishing her, or plunge into deep water with a stranger offering the prospect of learning to swim. Elena began walking without a specific destination, driven by a need for motion. And between the office and her eventual endpoint, she acknowledged her decision was already made. It had been made when she packed her bag. The legal counsel Elena retained charged $300 an hour and provided commensurate value. Martha Castellano presented with gray hair in a bun sharp enough to cut glass, reading glasses on a chain, and eyes that suggested an exhaustive familiarity with every form of human folly. This is either the most strategic action you've ever taken or the most self-destructive, Martha stated, placing the contract down after 2 hours of scrutiny. I have yet to determine which. Elena was seated opposite her in a room scented with old books and high-grade coffee. That is hardly a comfort. It is not intended as such. You are entering a marriage with a near stranger for financial gain, with a predetermined end date. No part of this should feel comforting. Martha gestured to a section marked with a yellow flag. That noted, the document itself is unexpectedly robust. The drafter made a genuine attempt to protect both parties. An unusual occurrence. Typically, these contracts are engineered to exploit one individual. So you advise I sign it. I advise that you comprehend what you are signing. Martha produced a legal pad filled with annotations. The compensation schedule is aggressive yet equitable. The termination clauses afford you numerous exit strategies should conditions deteriorate. The non-disclosure agreements offer you as much protection as they do him. However, Elena, this remains a profound risk. You are legally binding yourself to a man known for business ruthlessness. Should he choose to breach the terms, you have legal options. But legal options do not reverse psychological damage. Elena had dedicated 3 days to this single focus. 3 days of avoiding her family's escalating calls, residing on her friend Maya's sofa, and attempting to envision a future that did not provoke a panic response. What would your course of action be in my position? Martha offered a thin, knowing smile. I would analyze what I am fleeing from versus what I am moving toward. If the former outweighs the latter, you are committing an error. But if you are advancing toward something more significant than what you are leaving, then the risk may be justifiable. That is highly philosophical for an attorney. I am a complex individual. Martha slid the contract across the desk. My professional assessment is that this document is legally sound, and its terms are as advantageous as can be expected in such an arrangement. My personal observation is that your affect is more animated discussing this extreme plan than it likely has been in years. Interpret that as you see fit. Elena executed the contract that afternoon in Martha's office, her signature appearing unusually small on the designated line. Martha served as witness, created copies, and confirmed she would file the requisite documents. The entire procedure lasted 20 minutes and altered the subject's entire life trajectory. One final point Martha added as Elena was departing: the prenuptial condition regarding romantic feelings nullifying the contract. It was an astute move, but exercise caution. The boundary between performing a role and experiencing a genuine emotion can become indistinct. Do not engage in self-deception regarding your position. The admonition settled heavily in Elena's stomach during the car ride back to Maya's residence. Her phone displayed 17 missed calls from her mother, 9 from Victoria, and a single call from her father she assessed as likely containing threats. She disregarded them all, dispatching one text message to Adrian's number. Contract executed. What is the next step? His reply was instantaneous. We formalize it legally tomorrow, 10 a.m. City Hall. Bring identification and the executed contract. I will manage all other logistics. Elena stared at the text. Tomorrow, in less than 24 hours, she would be married to a man with whom she had interacted on precisely 2 occasions. The sheer irrationality of the act should have triggered a flight response. Instead, she registered a feeling that bordered on relief. Maya discovered her in the apartment's small balcony, observing the flow of traffic below. Your expression suggests you are contemplating emesis or defenestration. I request you do neither. I signed it. Elena displayed the phone. The ceremony is tomorrow. God. Maya collapsed onto the other plastic chair, which protested audibly. Right. Okay, we are proceeding. Do you have appropriate attire? You cannot be married in denim. It is merely a legal procedure. It is not a legitimate wedding. It is legitimate enough to be legally binding. You will wear something respectable. Maya stood, exhibiting the resolve of one who attacks a problem with immediate action. Let's go. We are going shopping. Maya, I lack the funds for my treat. Regarded as a wedding gift for the most irrational decision of your life. She pulled Elena upright. Moreover, if you are undertaking this, you will do so properly. You will enter that city hall presenting as someone who chose this, not someone being escorted to her doom. They located a dress in a small shop known to Maya, cream-colored and simple, yet tailored to appear deliberate. The sales clerk inquired if it was for a significant event, and Maya announced, courthouse wedding, with such conviction that the clerk offered them champagne, which both declined. Back at the apartment, Elena donned the dress once more, observing her reflection in Maya's full-length mirror. She resembled a subject role-playing a life that was not her own, or perhaps she resembled someone finally inhabiting a life that was a proper fit. You are certain of this? Maya inquired, observing from the doorway. Because withdrawal is still an option. You could remain here, secure employment, construct a different life. Marrying a stranger is not the only means of escaping your family. I am not merely escaping them. I am purchasing the time to define my identity separate from them. Elena turned from the reflection. 12 months, that is the full extent. 12 months of psychological space and sufficient capital at the end to truly begin anew. And if it fails, I will at least have made an attempt, rather than silently suffocating in that house for my remaining years. Elena sat on the bed, suddenly overcome with fatigue. I am weary of being invisible, Maya. I am weary of being the unwanted daughter, the forgotten sister. This may be an act of folly, but it is my own. I am choosing it. That must hold some value. Maya sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, a familiar proximity from their college years when Elena was the quiet roommate, and Maya the extrovert who had unilaterally declared their friendship. The affirmation is noted, and protective assurances are offered. A cautionary directive is issued regarding the subject. Adrian, citing the psychotropic effects of power. Subject Elena subsequently experienced a period of acute insomnia, engaging in obsessive rumination on negative potential outcomes from her new arrangement. By morning, she had formulated over 30 distinct failure scenarios, yet exhibited no signs of decisional regret. At 900 hours, she adopted the prescribed attire, a cream ensemble, and applied cosmetics to project an image of authority. The presentation achieved a state between professional composure and palpable anxiety. At 9:30, a summons arrived from Adrian via text message. After a high-pressure embrace with her associate, Elena descended to a waiting vehicle, an unmarked luxury sedan. An operator admitted her to the passenger cabin, which was appointed in materials valued in excess of her personal assets. Transit to the municipal center required 15 minutes. Subject Elena observed the urban environment through polarized windows, attempting to cognitively process the impending event. Her legal union to Adrian Volkov. He was present upon her arrival, positioned at the building's steps in a dark suit that amplified his imposing stature. A subtle, affective shift was observed in his expression as she emerged from the vehicle, a modulation from his baseline-controlled neutrality. He provided a generic, yet subjectively impactful, compliment on her appearance. Elena reciprocated the platitude and positioned herself at his side, using her handbag as a tactile anchor. She verbalized a state of extreme apprehension. He responded by validating her fear as a functional indicator of situational awareness before directing her toward the entrance. He outlined the procedural nature of their 10-minute appointment: rudimentary vows, signatures, and legal filings, emphasizing its transactional finality. He then proceeded into the facility, and she complied. The officiating clerk, a female in her 50s, displayed behavior consistent with occupational desensitization to the marital ritual. She conducted identity and documentation verification before escorting them to a small, fluorescently lit chamber. She inquired about ceremonial rings, anticipating a negative response. Adrian confirmed their absence. The clerk presented a laminated card containing the standardized script, noting its 5-minute duration and offering a window for personalization, which was declined by mutual nonverbal agreement. The subjects were positioned opposite each other as the clerk began a monotonous recitation of the legal proem. The subject, Elena, exhibited signs of dissociation, later reporting a diminished auditory processing of the ceremony. Her cognitive focus was instead on the surrealism of the environment and the high-risk, life-altering decision she was ratifying with a near stranger. The clerk posed the legal query. Do you, Adrian Volkov, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? His affirmation, I do, was delivered with a flat affect akin to finalizing a commercial contract. The query was then directed to subject Elena. Do you, Elena Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? This moment presented a final opportunity to abort the process. The subject reported experiencing significant physiological stress indicators. She verbalized her consent, I do, later describing the utterance as a point of no return. A legal document was then produced for signatures. Graphological analysis would note Adrian's bold, assertive script juxtaposed with Elena's more controlled, smaller hand. Following the clerk's witness and notarization, copies were issued with the declaration, "Congratulations, you're legally married." They were then prompted to vacate for the next scheduled appointment. They exited the facility in silence, with Elena clutching the certificate. The subject had been officially and legally joined to Adrian Volkov. This impulsive and high-risk action was completed in a time frame shorter than a typical retail transaction. On the exterior steps, Adrian turned to her and issued a set of directives. A vehicle was assigned to transport her to his residence, where an assistant would facilitate her integration. He stated a non-negotiable meeting at 1200 hours would prevent him from accompanying her, but he would return in the evening to review logistics. Elena expressed confusion, questioning his immediate departure. He reiterated his scheduling conflict and delegated her immediate needs to his subordinate, Marcus. He was already engaged with his mobile device, reviewing a dense schedule. He conveyed that household staff were briefed on her arrival and her quarters were prepared. He then proceeded toward a separate vehicle, leaving Elena with the marriage document. Feeling like a component processed through an efficient system, she vocalized his name to halt his departure. He paused at his vehicle's door. "This is highly anomalous," she stated. He acknowledged the assessment with a near smile, replying, "We consented to anomalous terms. Until this evening." He then departed, his vehicle merging into traffic. Elena was left in the charge of an operative named Marcus, a physically imposing individual with a notable lack of emotional expression. Marcus addressed her with the new legal honorific, Mrs. Volkov, as he opened the door to the other car. The name registered as a disorienting stimulus. After 24 years as Elena Whitmore, a 5-minute proceeding had overwritten her identity. The 40-minute transit moved from the urban core toward an exclusive residential zone. They entered a private road, and the residence became visible, a modern structure of glass and stone projecting controlled power. Marcus provided his first unsolicited data point. Mr. Volkov personally supervised the design. Elena analyzed the structure's aesthetic, noting its congruence with architectural publications. Clean lines and high-value materials, a stark contrast to her familial home's pretense of heritage. This was an unapologetic display of modern wealth. Marcus parked in a circular drive where a female in her 60s stood waiting. Her appearance suggested extensive experience managing high-profile households. "Mrs. Volkov," the woman stated upon Elena's exit. "I am Sarah Chen, the house manager. Welcome." She proceeded to lead Elena inside, her footwear echoing on the polished concrete floors. The interior was minimalist yet functional, featuring high ceilings and carefully curated art. Sarah commenced a tour, outlining the functions of the main floor: kitchen, dining room, library, and Adrian's office, which was designated a restricted area. She explained the second floor's layout, with the subject's quarters in the east wing and his in the west, each a self-contained suite. A gymnasium and pool were also inventoried. Accessing the second floor via a floating staircase, Sarah presented Elena's assigned quarters. The space was approximately 3 times the area of her previous bedroom, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows and high-end furnishings. The bathroom was finished in marble and glass, and the walk-in closet exceeded the square footage of small apartments. Sarah reported that the subject's personal effects were in transit, but that Mr. Volkov had prearranged for immediate necessities. A foundational wardrobe in her size was already in place, along with toiletries. She concluded by stating, "If there are any deficiencies, inform me for immediate rectification." Elena moved to the window, observing gardens that were clearly maintained at great expense. "This is disorienting." "Yes, I expect so." Sarah's tone was clinical but not hostile. "Mr. Dr. Volkov has clarified the nature of your arrangement. I have been in his employ for 8 years, and I can state he is exacting but fair. Adhere to the house protocols, respect his privacy, and you will encounter no issues." "What are the house protocols?" "Do not enter his office without explicit permission. Do not speak of his business affairs with anyone external to this household. Do not make any commitments on his behalf. Maintain your personal quarters as you wish, but show respect for the common areas." Dinner is served at 7 when he is present, but joint meals are not mandatory outside of social obligations. The staff consists of myself, Marcus, whom you met, a chef, a housekeeper, and a gardener. We are all discreet and loyal to Adrian. Any questions? Elena possessed roughly 1,000 questions, but few that Sarah was equipped to answer. When will I be introduced to the other staff? They will present themselves as required. We are here to facilitate your life, not to be intrusive. Sarah moved toward the exit. You may acclimate. An intercom is available should you require assistance. Activate the switch near the door for a response. Sustenance is served at 7, either with Adrian or delivered to your room. Following Sarah's departure, Elena exhibited symptoms of acute disorientation, attempting to cognitively process her new circumstances. The clinical finality of the state-sanctioned union heightened her distress. Her device alerted her to 17 communications, all from her family of origin, which she had been consciously ignoring. The escalating urgency culminated in a paternal directive demanding her immediate return for corrective discussion, framing her autonomy as infantile misbehavior. In a dissociative act of finality, she texted her maternal figure, I am not returning. I am married. Cease all contact, before disabling the device. The succeeding hours passed in a state of anomic silence. Elena catalogued the meager belongings delivered from her prior residence and surveyed her new quarters, displaying difficulty integrating the opulence of the environment. The wardrobe contained clothing in her size, unremarkable but high-quality garments. The lavatory was stocked with her preferred personal care products, indicating prior surveillance, an act perceived as both invasive and considerate. At 6:30, she confronted the task of selecting an outfit for the evening meal with her new marital partner. Each option presented a conflict, too informal, too studied, too revealing of effort. She chose dark jeans and a sweater to project an image of baseline normalcy, then descended, feeling the profound alienation of a trespasser. Adrian was in the kitchen instructing a chef on produce. He appeared as he had earlier, minus his tie, and with his sleeves rolled, a casual presentation more psychologically disarming than his professional persona. You have oriented yourself, he stated, a declaration rather than an inquiry. Sarah is highly competent. Elena remained at the threshold, exhibiting behavioral paralysis, uncertain of her role or expected actions. He directed her to cease her display of submissive uncertainty and to occupy a space at the dining table, which was prepared for 2 with platters already present. He informed her that the chef, Thomas, who had been with him for 5 years, was emotionally invested in his culinary work, instructing her to simulate enjoyment to avoid giving offense. Thomas offered a brief smile before retreating. Elena sat, and Adrian served her portion before his own in a display of performative domesticity that induced a psychosomatic reaction of discomfort. Describe your afternoon, Adrian inquired, dissecting his fish with clinical precision. Anomalous, disorienting. I deactivated my phone to terminate familial harassment. Elena displaced food on her plate. Was your meeting successful? Tedious? Standard? He consumed his meal with an efficiency that prioritized function over sensory experience. Your family's efforts will intensify. They will eventually appear here or use alternative methods to establish contact. You will determine the response. I will not intervene unless solicited. Their reaction to our union will be extreme. Their reaction to my terminating the engagement to Victoria was already extreme. This is merely the subsequent phase. Adrian paused his meal, making direct eye contact. It is critical you understand, Elena, that your family will deploy every available psychological weapon: guilt, duty, financial leverage, and social condemnation. They will assert that I am manipulating you and that you are self-destructing. Some of their assertions may even contain truth, but the contract you signed provides you with agency. Do not permit them to make you forget that. Elena ingested a piece of salmon, its exceptional quality lost on her muted palate. Why are you adopting a supportive posture? You could simply command me to manage it. I could, but our cohabitation is mandated for the next 12 months. Your sustained misery would be inefficient. He resumed eating. Furthermore, I am familiar with familial structures that operate as corporate entities. I understand their methodologies. Is that analogous to your family? Adrian's expression became impassive. My family is a restricted topic, as stipulated in Section 12 of the contract. Elena exhibited a startled response to the abrupt shift in tone. Acknowledged. My apologies. They continued the meal in silence, the prior rapport having dissipated. Elena was formulating a strategy to re-engage when Adrian initiated a new topic. There is a charity gala next Friday. Formal attire. Attendance is required for business purposes and will serve as our initial public appearance as a married couple. He delivered this information with the detachment of scheduling a routine procedure. Your presence is required, and you must project an image of appropriate contentment. Can you perform this function? I can simulate contentment for several hours, yes. Good. My assistant will provide a full briefing. Attire. Schedule and dossiers on key individuals. These functions are tedious but necessary. Attempt to mask your boredom. I will endeavor not to be a social liability, Elena stated, her tone exhibiting passive aggression. Adrian's gaze sharpened. That was not my implication, was it not? You required a proxy capable of a convincing performance. That is the service for which I was acquired. I did not acquire you. We entered into an agreement. He placed his utensil down with deliberate control. And I do not anticipate you will be a liability. I anticipate your performance will exceed your own expectations. However, you must cease projecting perceived insults where none exist. Elena experienced a physiological heat response in her face. You are correct. My apologies. This is overwhelming. It is. His voice modulated, softening slightly. But this was the expected outcome. The initial phase is invariably the most difficult. They concluded the meal with superficial dialogue on neutral subjects: the residence, the locale, the logistics of their shared space. The interaction mirrored that of two strangers negotiating cohabitation, which was their precise reality. Afterward, Elena went to her room and contacted Maya via the house landline. Status report, Maya demanded. Are you alive? Detained? Shall I activate an external response? I am functional. The residence is excessive. The staff is proficient. I have had a meal with my husband, a near stranger, and the experience was defined by its profound social awkwardness. Elena assumed a supine position on her bed. The situation is highly irregular, Maya. Irregular, but thus far manageable. Re-evaluate in 1 week after I am compelled to enact the role of a contented spouse at a high society event. You will excel. Simply adopt the persona of Victoria for the performance aspects. That is poor counsel, and also likely effective. Elena laughed, an involuntary response. I already miss baseline reality. Baseline reality was causing systemic failure. This may be irregular, but it is a deviation. Maya paused. Report in daily. I require confirmation of your well-being beyond verbal assurances. After terminating the call, Elena lay in the foreign bed and attempted to reinforce the logic of her decision. Tomorrow, she would shift from a survival-based modality to one of strategic adaptation. Tomorrow, she would exhibit greater resilience and certainty. Tonight, she felt diminished, anxious, and profoundly disconnected from any sense of a home environment. She must have entered a sleep state, as she awoke to solar ingress through unshielded windows and the jarring realization that the previous day's events were factual. She was married and resided in Adrian Volkov's home. Her former life had been exchanged for this new, unfamiliar construct. Her reactivated phone displayed 43 missed calls and 62 text messages. The majority originated from her family, their tone progressing from confusion to hostility to overt threats. However, 3 were from Victoria, which she compelled herself to analyze. The first, "How could you perpetrate this against me?" The second, "Your marriage to him is public knowledge. You are a laughingstock, a pathetic substitute." The third, "I hope you are satisfied with this familial demolition. Your envy was always apparent, and now it is confirmed." Elena purged all 3 messages and blocked the contact. She lacked the emotional resources to process Victoria's rage. A knock on the door triggered a startled reflex. Enter. Sarah appeared with a tray bearing coffee, fruit, and aromatic pastries. A domestic staff member relayed that the subject, Mr. Vulov, would be unavailable until the evening meal. His handler, Claire, was scheduled to contact the patient at 10 to coordinate gala logistics. When asked about her needs, the patient requested a vehicle, citing a desire to vacate the premises for several hours. A car was provided. The patient, Elena, then relocated to a public cafe where she conducted extensive research on the subject, Adrian. His corporate structure was more labyrinthine than initially assessed, encompassing real estate, venture capital, and technology. He held positions on 3 corporate boards and chaired 2 charitable foundations, with a documented history of brilliant yet merciless negotiation tactics. Photographic evidence showed a pattern of public appearances with various female companions, all appearing decorative and transient. No subject was ever seen twice, and no significant emotional attachments were recorded. This pattern suggested a systematic avoidance of genuine emotional connection, consistent with his stated philosophy of calculated relationships, a finding the patient registered with notable depressive affect. The handler, Claire, initiated contact at precisely 1000 hours, her vocal tone exhibiting marked efficiency. She identified herself as Adriana's assistant, tasked with managing the patient's public schedule, specifically for the upcoming Friday gala. A protocol was outlined covering attire, grooming appointments, and intelligence dossiers on event attendees. These dossiers were described as background materials on key individuals, their professional roles, and their strategic importance to Adrian's interests, framed as a tool for social navigation. Claire's delivery normalized this highly structured procedure. A stylist was scheduled to arrive the following day at 2, bringing wardrobe options for the patient's selection. Adrian's preference was noted as irrelevant, provided the patient's appearance was deemed appropriate. This level of organization was noted. "It is my function," the handler stated, her tone implying high proficiency. The dossiers would be transmitted electronically that evening with an instruction to review them before Friday. When queried for questions, the patient exhibited avoidant behavior. The response was negative. Excellent. The communication terminated, leaving the patient in the cafe with a documented feeling of being systematically processed. Every facet of Adriana's environment appeared to function with a frictionless, organized precision engineered for optimal output. This observation, rather than providing reassurance, induced feelings of depersonalization, likening her role to that of an impersonal, replaceable component within a larger apparatus. The afternoon was spent in aimless ambulation through the city, an exercise in anonymous public existence. This act appeared to be a pursuit of miniature freedom, a state where her location and activities were unmonitored and without external demands. For a brief period, she achieved integration as an anonymous entity within a crowd. Upon returning to the residence at approximately 1700 hours, a package was discovered in her room. It contained a credit card bearing her new legal name, accompanied by a note in precise script. For whatever you need, no limit, no questions. The patient fixated on the card. The concept of no limit was noted. With this, she possessed access to financial resources far exceeding her previous life experience. The power inherent in this access was perceived as almost obscene. The card was placed in her wallet, and the patient actively suppressed further cognitive engagement with the implications of her husband's capacity to grant unlimited funds without concern for consequence. The evening meal was marked by a subdued atmosphere. Both subjects, Adrian and Elena, displayed signs of exhaustion. They consumed a pasta meal and engaged in superficial conversation. The shared fatigue appeared to lower the necessity for social performance, creating a less tense dynamic. "How was your initial full day as Mrs. Vulov?" the subject inquired while serving wine, which the patient accepted despite her uncertainty. "Surreal. I purchased coffee using your credit card and experienced feelings of criminality." The patient ingested the wine, a beverage likely valued higher than her prior weekly food budget. Claire initiated contact regarding the gala. "She is remarkably efficient. She is the sole component ensuring my life's functionality. My existence would be overwhelmed by logistics otherwise." The subject assumed a more relaxed posture, shedding some of his corporate persona. "You will perform adequately at the gala. Maintain proximity to me, exhibit positive affect at designated moments, and allow me to manage the political engagements. That is the full extent of your duties. Just smile and project contentment. That is the requirement." "I am not requesting a miraculous performance, Elena. Simply be present and do not appear miserable," he observed her briefly. "Unless you find that request to be excessive." "No, that is manageable." The patient set down her wine glass. "May I pose a question?" "That is contingent on the question. Why do you lack friends?" "All my research, every article concerning you, details only business associates or strategic alliances, but no individuals who appear to possess genuine intimacy with you." Adrian remained silent for a duration sufficient for the patient to assume he would not respond. He then stated, "Because friendship necessitates trust, and trust is a liability I cannot afford." "That seems incredibly isolating." "Correct, but loneliness is a predictable variable. Humans are not." He began clearing the table, a task typically performed by staff. "I learned long ago that emotional investment in people grants them the power to inflict harm. It is more efficient to avoid caring. Is that your assessment of this?" The patient gestured between them. "A structure in which neither party cares." "Is that not what it is?" She could not formulate a response. They concluded the cleanup in silence, their movements coordinated but lacking emotional resonance, like dancers executing choreography without music. Upon finishing, Adrienne retreated to his office, while Elena ascended to her room. In bed that night, the patient ruminated on trust, loneliness, and the paradox of constructing a life with another while maintaining a strategic distance. She had consented to 12 months of this exact paradigm: controlled separation, defined boundaries, and zero emotional entanglement. However, a previous warning from a third party echoed in her thoughts. At times, the boundary between role performance and authentic emotion can become indistinct. She entered sleep contemplating on which side of that boundary she currently resided, and if the distinction would hold any significance by the time she could identify it. The stylist arrived at 200 hours precisely, carrying enough garment bags for a small bridal party. Her name was Simone, and she possessed an effortless elegance that made the patient feel inadequate within her own residence. Claire transmitted your measurements and event specifications, Simone stated, arranging dresses on the bed with surgical precision. Black tie charity gala. The attendees are conservative, but not dull. Your appearance must suggest effortless belonging. We will determine what is effective. The patient tried on 7 garments before Simone signaled a satisfaction with the 8th, a deep emerald silk gown that conveyed high value without being ostentatious. The fit was perfect, a fact that felt more invasive than gratifying, as it implied her precise measurements were known without her consent. This is the one, Simone declared. It is sophisticated. It will photograph well, and the color complements your skin. Adrienne will approve. Does he typically approve your selections? Elena inquired, examining her reflection. Adrienne is indifferent to fashion. He is concerned with individuals appearing appropriate to the context. Simone produced a jewelry case. These are loaned from an associate indebted to me. Simple emerald earrings. Nothing to compete with the dress. Your objective is not to be the most memorable individual present. Your objective is to be appropriately invisible while positioned next to him. The term struck the patient with more force than likely intended. Appropriately invisible. The patient had spent her entire life mastering that specific skill. Now she was being compensated to deploy it professionally. After Simone's departure with the rejected garments and a promise of footwear, the patient located the electronic briefing materials from Claire, 43 pages of dossiers on gala attendees, their identities, professions, connections to Adrienne's interests, and a list of proscribed conversation topics. The documents read like intelligence files, a feature that was likely by design. She was partway through committing to memory the details of a real estate developer named Marcus Chen when Adrienne materialized in her doorway, still attired in a suit from his afternoon's engagement. Simone located a viable option? He inquired. Apparently, she indicated you would approve, a statement I am attempting not to overanalyze. The patient closed her laptop. Do you routinely have your assistant dispatch 40-page briefings on party guests? Only for events where the conversations are consequential. He leaned against the doorframe, his fatigue making him appear almost human. Did you review the section on Senator Morrison, the one obstructing your financial district development project? Yes. His wife, Caroline Morrison, will be in attendance. She is the dominant force in that pairing, and she has a proclivity for landscape architecture. Adrienne's expression shifted, becoming calculative. If you can engage her on the topic of urban green spaces, she might reconsider her stance on the project or at minimum cease her active opposition. The patient stared at him. You want me to manipulate a senator's spouse by leveraging my knowledge of parks? I want you to engage in an authentic conversation regarding a subject of your genuine interest. If it happens to advance my business objectives, that is merely a matter of efficiency." He presented the directive as entirely reasonable. "You're not required to do so if you feel uncomfortable, but you are better suited to converse with Carolyn Morrison than I am. Because she appreciates plants and I am a woman. Because she is weary of individuals attempting to impress her with political maneuvering. And you possess an authentic passion for the subject, rather than viewing it as an instrument." Adrian pushed away from the doorframe. "But as I stated, it is your decision. I will not compel you to engage in strategies you find objectionable." After his departure, the patient was left to process the inherent wrongness of the proposition. He was instructing her to weaponize genuine curiosity, a directive more unsettling than a simple request for deception. Yet he had also provided the option of refusal, implying a respect for boundaries she had not anticipated. She returned to the dossier, re-examining the section on Caroline Morrison. The subject held a master's degree in environmental policy, served on 3 conservation committees, and had obstructed 2 major development projects. She was not a subject susceptible to superficial charm or manipulation. This indicated Adrian was either assessing Elena's capabilities or genuinely believed an authentic dialogue could succeed where political leverage had failed. She could not determine which scenario was more psychologically disturbing. The subsequent 3 days established a routine that approximated normalcy if Elena engaged in cognitive avoidance. Adrian departed early for business, returned for the evening meal on most nights, and they would engage in conversation on neutral topics that demanded no emotional vulnerability. The initial cohabitation period was characterized by a sterile, transactional efficiency. Their interactions were perfunctory, with a notable absence of genuine emotional exchange. However, the subject, Elena, began exhibiting hyper-awareness of the catalyst's presence. She reported observing him in unguarded moments and unconsciously tracking his movements. This marks the blurring of the line between the contractual performance and an emergent emotional reality, a predictable development forecasted by her confidant, Martha, which induced a state of psychological uncertainty in the subject. The arrival of a significant social event on Friday was perceived with an anxiety akin to an execution date, prompting the subject to seek external reassurance from a friend, Maya, who provided a standardized motivational speech. The subject verbalizes acute feelings of inadequacy. The response from her peer attempts to validate her position through her marital link to Adrian Volkov, equating her status with the other spouses present. The subject's peer then acknowledged the flawed delivery of her encouragement. The directive was to resist social intimidation. At 4 o'clock, beauticians began constructing the subject's public facade. These technicians analyzed the guest list with tactical precision as they altered Elena's features for public display. By 6, she presented as an idealized version of herself, a state described as the objective. At 6:30, Adrian arrived, attired in a tuxedo of considerable value. He paused upon viewing her, his expression displaying a micro-reaction that was too brief to classify. His verbal affirmation, "You look good," was a significant understatement, nearly provoking an involuntary laugh from Elena. Credit was deferred to Simone and the team of specialists. The subject acquired a clutch purse matching her attire. She then inquired if he was prepared for the social performance. He confirmed his standard level of readiness. He offered his arm with a mechanical formality suggesting a practiced but tiresome protocol. The instruction was to forego any attempt to impress the attendees. Her mandate was simply to be present and to mask any negative affect. All other behaviors were deemed non-essential. The event was located at a historical estate, rented to project an image of established wealth. The approach was congested with high-value vehicles, while photographers formed a receiving line for documentation. Adrian maintained physical contact, his hand on the small of Elena's back, a gesture that was light yet possessive. He murmured, "Smile," as cameras activated. He classified this part of the evening as rudimentary. Internally, the venue conformed to Elena's expectations. It featured crystal chandeliers, a live string quartet, and service staff dispensing champagne and hors d'oeuvres of inflated value. The attendees displayed their status through designer attire and valuable jewelry, all engaged in a practiced performance of social importance. A female in her 50s, Catherine, materialized, greeting Adrian with familiar kisses on both cheeks. She remarked, "And you must be the mysterious bride who is the subject of current speculation." Adrienne smoothly introduced Catherine Hayes, Elena Volaf. Catherine directs the foundation this event supports. The subject offered a polite greeting. Catherine's smile appeared genuine, but her gaze was analytical. I must admit, hearing of Adrian's marriage was a considerable shock. He has actively resisted commitment for the duration of our acquaintance. Elena responded, "Sometimes the appropriate individual can alter one's perspective." A fabrication that came with surprising ease. Evidently. Catherine's attention shifted between them as if attempting to resolve a cognitive puzzle. "Well, I welcome you to this charade. The events are tedious but obligatory. The wine is at least of good quality." After she moved to engage other attendees, Adrian leaned in, his proximity allowing Elena to detect his cologne. Well executed, Catherine's validation is important. The subject responded, "I'm uncertain of her approval. Her demeanor suggests suspicion." He countered, "She is perpetually suspicious. It is an asset in her profession." He procured 2 glasses of champagne from a server, passing one to Elena. Observe the couple near the fireplace. That is Senator Morrison and his wife Carolyn. I will facilitate an introduction when an opportunity arises. Elena ingested the champagne, attempting to suppress a rising physiological anxiety response. She had allocated 3 days to memorizing data on the attendees, preparing for interactions with stakes she did not fully comprehend. The experience was analogous to studying for an examination in an unknown subject. The subsequent hour consisted of a rapid sequence of introductions and scripted conversations. Adrienne navigated the social environment with practiced skill, fostering connections and managing relationships with a strategic mindset likely applied to his business affairs. Elena performed her designated role, smiling at socially appropriate intervals, offering neutral observations, and attempting to conceal her profound sense of displacement. Adrian then guided her toward the Morrisons, using subtle pressure from his hand on her back. "Senator Mrs. Morrison, it is good to see you both," Adrian stated, with a calibrated degree of warmth. It was amicable, yet not overly familiar. "I would like to introduce my wife, Elena." Senator Morrison was a man of large physical stature, with a politician's handshake and a gaze that assessed potential leverage. His wife, Caroline, was physically smaller, more understated, with features suggesting she processed more information than she divulged. "My congratulations on your marriage," Caroline stated in a neutral tone. "It was rather abrupt, was it not?" Elena, maintaining a stable vocal tone, replied, "Sometimes certainty arrives quickly. When the conditions are correct, there is no value in delay." "How refreshingly spontaneous." Caroline's smile did not engage her eyes. Adrian does not present as a spontaneous individual. People can be surprising, Adrian interjected smoothly. Elena, Mrs. Morrison has performed remarkable work with urban conservation initiatives. I suspected a potential shared interest between you. The maneuver was so transparent that Elena almost laughed. However, Caroline's expression changed, her suspicion giving way to curiosity. You have an interest in conservation? Caroline inquired. Specifically landscape architecture, urban green spaces, and sustainable design. Elena determined that authenticity would be less taxing than continued performance. The subject expressed a preference for the topic, noting its superiority over standard event discourse. Caroline responded with laughter, a genuine reaction causing a complete shift in her facial topography. An admission of mutual boredom was observed. She then pivoted to the Bryant Park Restoration Project, questioning the subject's stance on native versus ornamental plantings. They engaged in a conversation detached from Adrian's business agenda, focusing on the stated topic. Caroline demonstrated informed positions on biodiversity, public access, park funding politics, and the maintenance of urban green spaces. The subject's anxiety subsided, replaced by engagement with a seemingly like-minded individual. Adrian and the senator disengaged to confer elsewhere, isolating Elena and Caroline near a window overlooking the estate's gardens. Your husband is attempting to leverage you to manipulate my position on his financial district project, Caroline stated. Her tone clinical and devoid of accusation. The subject exhibited a sudden cutaneous vasodilation in the face. Affirmative, likely. His actions are universally strategic. Yet you are engaged in authentic dialogue, not executing the strategy. Caroline observed her with acute focus. An interesting deviation. I am not proficient in manipulation. The energy expenditure appears high. It is a draining process. This is why I value direct human-to-human communication. Caroline raised her glass. For the record, I find merit in Adrian's project, pending proper environmental impact assessments. However, his current methodology, reliant on legal and political pressure, provokes a desire to obstruct it based on principle. Have you communicated this to him? He is non-receptive. Individuals like your husband perceive resistance as a signal to increase pressure. Caroline's expression indicated familiarity with the pattern. Perhaps you can reframe it in terms he can process. Directness can be more effective than strategy. After Caroline departed to engage other guests, Elena remained at the window, processing whether the interaction had been a gift of intelligence or a compliance test. The assessment concluded it was both. You possess a talent for this, a male voice remarked beside her. Elena turned, identifying a man in his 30s, wearing expensive eyewear and a smile indicating privileged knowledge. Apologies. I'm David Reeves. I consult with Adrian on technology ventures, Elena Volkov. The name still registered as foreign to her. I am aware. Your identity is known to everyone present. You are the enigmatic wife who materialized unexpectedly. David's tone was affable but interrogative. I confess to being curious about your union with Adrian. He has remained intentionally unattached for as long as I have known him. We met at a charity function, discussed parks. We discovered more commonalities than anticipated. Elena recited the prepared narrative, aiming for an air of convincing spontaneity. Parks. That may be the least compelling origin story I have ever encountered, which paradoxically enhances its believability. David laughed. Still, the timing is noteworthy. occurring immediately after the Victoria Whitmore situation disintegrated. The subject experienced a physiological response consistent with the sudden drop in core temperature. I am uncertain of your meaning, merely that it is a convenient coincidence. Adrian terminates one engagement and promptly marries another individual from the same lineage. This will generate speculation. He delivered the line lightly, but it contained an underlying threat. I am not implying impropriety, naturally, simply observing that perception is critical in our social strata. Then they are free to speculate. Elena maintained a level vocal tone. My relationship with Adrian is unrelated to my sister. Of course not. David's smile broadened. I am certain it is precisely that simple. Well, it was a pleasure to meet you, Elena. I anticipate further encounters. He withdrew, leaving Elena applying sufficient pressure to her champagne flute to risk structural failure. The exchange, while superficially polite, contained a clear message. She was under surveillance for vulnerabilities. Adrian appeared at her side moments later, interpreting her tension instantly. What occurred? David Reeves occurred. He was impeccably polite while insinuating our marriage was chronologically suspect. Elena placed her glass down before she could shatter it. Is this passive-aggressive behavior standard for everyone here, or is it reserved for the new wife? It is the standard operational procedure. It is how these circles function. Attack without direct confrontation, probe for weakness while preserving plausible deniability. Adrienne's jaw muscles tensed. What were his exact words? Elena relayed the conversation, observing as Adrian's expression became cold, a reminder of his capacity for danger. I will manage David, he stated quietly. Do not. It will escalate the situation. It will portray me as requiring protection. Elena was surprised by the authority in her own voice. I can handle speculation and gossip. I was raised with Victoria. I understand the mechanics of this. Adrian observed her for a sustained moment, his expression undergoing a subtle change. Very well, but should speculation manifest as direct harassment, I require notification. For the subsequent hour, they maintained their public personas. The subject, Elena, engaged with numerous individuals to the point of cognitive overload, forcing a facial expression of pleasantness that induced muscular pain, all while consciously suppressing the psychological weight of observation. Upon departure, she exhibited a profound exhaustion unrelated to physical exertion. In transit, Adrian remained silent, observing the urban landscape. Your performance tonight was adequate, he finally remarked. More than adequate. Caroline Morrison displayed a positive facial response, an outcome I have failed to produce in 3 months of negotiation. Her assessment is that you are overly aggressive. She posits that direct honesty would be more effective than legal pressure. Adrian reoriented his posture toward her. She disclosed that to you? Indeed, her addendum was. Your project is viable, provided you correctly address the environmental issues. Elena tilted her head back against the upholstery. My analysis is she was evaluating my loyalty, testing whether I would relay the intel or withhold it for personal leverage. And you are relaying it because the cognitive load of manipulation is draining, and I lack the energy for strategic games. Elena ceased visual input. Also, her assessment is likely accurate. Your demeanor does present as excessively aggressive. She anticipated a defensive reaction to the critique, but he instead produced a genuine laugh, not his corporate affectation. That may be the most unvarnished feedback I have received in years. All other associates provide curated, approval-seeking responses. Would you prefer I adopt that methodology? No. The denial was delivered with uncharacteristic intensity. No, I would not. They completed the journey in a non-tense silence, which could be classified as a form of progress. Upon arrival, Elena removed the high-cost footwear Simone had supplied, resulting in an immediate height reduction of 3 inches and a corresponding increase in her sense of self. "I appreciate your actions," Adrian stated in the foyer, "tonight, for participating." "It was our contractual obligation." Elena initiated her assent, then paused. "Adrian, the point David raised about timing and optics, will it present a complication?" Individuals will invariably engage in speculation. Their conclusions are irrelevant so long as we maintain a shared, private reality. He loosened his tie, appearing as fatigued as she felt. "Obtain some sleep. We can conduct a debriefing tomorrow if you wish." Elena ascended to her room, removed the emerald dress, and stored it carefully, as if it were evidence from a life she was still attempting to codify. She removed the professional-grade cosmetics and examined her own face, attempting to reconcile the operative who had survived a high society event with the individual who had spent years cultivating invisibility. She was preparing for bed when her phone activated. It was Mia's number. "Report," Mia said. Surprisingly positive, until an individual implied I was a financial opportunist who had manipulated her way into Adrian's life. Elena positioned herself in bed, using the blankets as a defensive barrier, but I endured. I engaged in a substantive conversation about landscape architecture, and only experienced the urge to flee screaming approximately 3 times. That constitutes a successful outcome. Mia's voice conveyed relief. "You see, you are capable of this. I am uncertain of my capacity to sustain it for 12 months. Every person there was engaged in constant performance, calculating every word, seeking advantage in every exchange. It was depleting. Then cease performing. Simply be yourself and force them to adapt." Mia yawned audibly. "You are not obligated to engage in their psychological games simply because you now occupy their environment." After terminating the call, Elena lay in the dark, analyzing the concepts of performance and authenticity, and the definition of self when one's identity is uncertain. She had spent so long fulfilling a familial role, unseen, compliant, unremarkable, that she had lost data on her own core programming. Perhaps the next 12 months were not merely about surviving a contractual arrangement. Perhaps they were about identifying who Elena was in the absence of external directives. The hypothesis was equally terrifying and liberating. She must have lost consciousness as her next sensory input was sunlight through the windows and a percussive impact on her door suggesting an emergency. Elena moved from the bed and opened the door, finding Sarah with a severe expression. "Your family unit is on site," Sarah said. "All of them. They are in the driveway, demanding access to you, and they refuse to withdraw." Elena experienced a visceral sinking sensation in her abdomen. How did they locate this address? Is that relevant? They are here. They are creating a disturbance, and their stated intention is to involve law enforcement if entry is denied. Sarah's expression was meticulously controlled, professionally neutral. "Adrian is occupied in his office, but he instructed me to ascertain your desired course of action." Elena dressed with trembling hands, her thoughts accelerating. She had anticipated this confrontation, but the timing was suboptimal. She required more time to fortify psychological defenses capable of withstanding her family's orchestrated assault. "Inform them I will meet them outside in 5 minutes," she instructed. and inform Adrian. Tell him I am managing this." Sarah acknowledged and withdrew. Elena completed her preparations, studying her reflection to summon a courage that felt largely abstract, then proceeded downstairs. Through the foyer windows, she observed 3 vehicles: her father's Mercedes, her mother's Range Rover, and Victoria's BMW. Her parents were positioned by the entrance, projecting an equal mixture of imperiousness and fury. Nearby, Victoria paced, her distress not diminishing her appearance, engaged in a rapid phone conversation. Elena regulated her breathing and opened the door. The stimulus produced an immediate response. Her mother's facial muscles contorted in rage. Her father advanced, a preparatory motion to physically obstruct her, and Victoria terminated her call with abrupt force. "What precisely have you done?" Catherine's vocal tone was sharp enough to be weaponized. "Do you possess any awareness of the consequences for this family? I have entered into a marriage. It is a common social ritual." Elena maintained her position on the top step, utilizing the height differential. "I suggest you vacate the premises. This is private land acquired with illicit funds by a criminal to whom you have bound yourself." Richard's face was flushed, his veins distended. "I am unaware of his promises or his manipulative tactics, but this concludes now. You will return home, and we will initiate an annulment of this sham marriage. I am 24 years old and married by my own volition. There are no grounds for annulment." Elena noted the unexpected stability in her own voice. "I am not returning. I have no desire for contact. Please depart." "You unappreciative little—" Catherine began to ascend the steps, but Elena maintained her position. "Do not." The word emerged with more force than intended. "My entire life has been an exercise in being grateful for minimal positive regard, for the least desirable bedroom, for mere tolerance within my own familial unit. I am finished being grateful for being treated as an inconvenience. We provided you with everything." Catherine's vocal pitch rose towards the hysterical. "A residence, an education, opportunities you would not have otherwise accessed. You provided me with a room comparable to a closet and fostered an expectation of gratitude. You neglected my birthday for 3 consecutive years. You introduced me as the other daughter," an afterthought. Elena felt years of suppressed resentment rising. "You provided the bare minimum of care and demanded worship in return." Victoria finally interjected, her voice unsteady with an unidentifiable emotion. "How could you marry him after his actions toward me? How?" "He did nothing to you, Victoria. He terminated an engagement that was fundamentally flawed, and then he married you." Victoria's placid features crumpled. "My own sister. You have been anticipating this, correct? Waiting for an opportunity to appropriate something that was mine. Adrian was never your possession. You desired the concept of him, the influence, the social standing, the trophy spouse. You had no knowledge of him nor any interest in acquiring it." Elena felt a sudden onset of fatigue, weary of the long-standing behavioral script. "I did not take him from you. He selected me because my behavior treated him as a human, not an award." "You are delusional if you believe he has genuine affection for you," Victoria retorted. "He is using you for a purpose. Men like Adrian Volkov do not marry non-entities without a motive." The term landed with its intended impact. Nobody. Elena had perceived it in subtle ways, but Victoria's verbalization of it felt like a physical impact. "Perhaps I am a nobody to you," Elena stated quietly. but I would prefer being a nobody to spending my life attempting to become someone you find acceptable." "This is nonsensical." Richard ascended another step, his proximity making his cologne detectable. "You are returning home immediately, Elena. We will address this rationally once you are calm and have ceased this immature defiance." "I am not defying. I am departing." Elena held her ground, resisting the instinct to retreat. "I owe you no rationale or apology. I made a decision. It is finalized. You made an error that will generate regret for the remainder of your life," Catherine said, her voice shifting to a tone more menacing than shouting. "When Adrian Volkov destroys you, and he will, as it is the nature of men like him, do not return to us seeking emotional support." "I will not," Elena said. "I can assure you of that." The door opened behind her, and Adrian emerged onto the porch. He made no physical contact with Elena, nor did he stand in close proximity, yet his presence fundamentally altered the confrontation's dynamic. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his perfect politeness carrying an implicit threat. "I understand my wife has requested you to leave. I would advise you to comply with that request." "You have no authority to isolate her from her family," Richard began, but Adrian silenced him with his gaze. "I am not isolating her from anyone. Elena is an adult exercising her own agency. If she wishes to see you, she will. Her lack of desire to do so is also her choice." His tone was agreeable, almost conversational, yet utterly rigid. "However, you are not permitted to appear at my residence making demands and threats." "That is not the protocol. How dare you?" Catherine started, but Adrian proceeded as if she were silent. "I have video documentation of this entire interaction. I also retain excellent legal counsel who would be pleased to discuss harassment and trespassing should this recur." He produced his phone. "Shall I contact them now, or do you prefer to exit voluntarily?" Victoria emitted a vocalization between a sob and a scream. "I detest you both. I hope you are miserable in your union." She retreated to her vehicle, closing the door with enough force to vibrate the windows, and accelerated away, leaving tire marks on the pavement. Catherine and Richard followed at a slower pace, their expressions indicating the conflict was not resolved, but their departure was the primary objective. Elena remained at the porch, observing the vehicle's retreat, feeling as though she had survived a psychologically destructive event that had failed to annihilate her. Her hands were shaking, a post-adrenaline systemic reaction now that the threat was removed. "Are you stable?" Adrian asked quietly. "No, but I will be." Elena wrapped her arms around her torso, experiencing a sudden chill. "Thank you for the reinforcement. It was not required." "Yes, it was. We are a unified entity, remember?" He paused, then added, "For what it's worth, you managed that encounter more effectively than my projections indicated. Most subjects collapse under that level of aggressive guilt induction. I have extensive practice in not collapsing." Elena turned to re-enter the house, then stopped. "Adrian, Victoria classified me as a nobody. Is that your assessment of my status?" He observed her for a prolonged moment, his expression unreadable. "I believe nobody is a label people apply to an individual they can no longer control. It is not a descriptor, it is a weapon. His observation that the pain persists indicates you have not fully severed your emotional investment in their opinion. Is that a negative indicator?" "It is a human trait." He held the door for her. "Let's proceed. Thomas has prepared breakfast, and you appear to require caffeine to remain functional." They sat in the kitchen, consuming eggs and toast as the tremors in Elena's hands subsided. Adrian did not compel her to speak or demand an emotional debriefing. His physical presence across from her provided a form of support that felt more substantial than verbal reassurances could have been. "They will persist," Elena stated eventually. "My family does not easily abandon a position when they perceive themselves to be correct." "Nor do I," Adrienne replied, refilling her coffee cup. "And my resources are considerably greater than theirs. Should they escalate, we will manage the situation jointly." The term jointly elicited a strange somatic response in Elena's chest. The arrangement was intended to be a transactional one with clear parameters. Yet, between the social performance and the familial conflict, a shift had occurred. Their dynamic was evolving into something that resembled an authentic partnership. "I require a walk," she stated suddenly, needing cognitive space. "To clear my head." "Take Marcus with you. Following this morning's events, I prefer you have security in close proximity." Elena lacked the energy to contest the directive. She changed into casual attire, and Marcus transported her to a park she had previously reconnoitered. He remained with the vehicle while she walked along pathways engineered to simulate a natural environment. The park was populated with weekend visitors, family units, and couples, all engrossed in lives oblivious to Elena's current state of crisis. She found this anonymity strangely therapeutic, a reminder that the world extended beyond her immediate problems. Her mobile phone vibrated. It was Maya checking on her status. Elena transmitted a brief reply asserting she was fine, a statement that was technically accurate despite feeling fundamentally false. She walked for an hour, allowing the physical activity to regulate her racing thoughts. Her family had confronted her, delivered hurtful statements, and departed. She had maintained her position and endured. That must be considered a positive outcome. Upon her return to the residence, Adrian was in the library with his laptop, processing what appeared to be a high volume of electronic mail. He looked up as she came in. "Better?" he inquired. "Progressing?" Elena sat in the opposing chair, suddenly averse to being alone. "May I ask you a personal question?" "You may ask. I may not provide an answer." "When did you last permit someone to genuinely know you? Not as a colleague or business associate, but to truly know you." Adrienne remained silent for a period long enough for Elena to assume he would not respond. He then said, "I was 19. Her name was Natasha. She died in a vehicle collision 6 months after we met. Following that, I concluded that emotional intimacy was too costly." The disclosure settled between them with a tangible weight. Elena had not anticipated such direct honesty and was uncertain how to process it. "I am sorry," she offered finally. "It was a long time ago." Adrian closed his laptop, focusing his complete attention on her. "What is the purpose of this inquiry?" "To ascertain if our arrangement remains performative or if an underlying emotional dynamic is developing." Elena maintained eye contact. "And I suspect you are attempting to ascertain the same." "Perhaps." He moved to the window overlooking the grounds. The agreement stipulates termination upon the development of romantic feelings, yet it fails to define the boundary between romance and simple concern for another's well-being. Is that your current state? Concern for my well-being? Yes. The admission was simple, a fact he seemed to have already processed, deviating from the initial protocol. Yet the situation persists. Elena stood beside him, close enough to register his body heat, but maintaining no physical contact. "So, What is our course of action? Unclear. The logical protocol would be to withdraw, reinforce boundaries, and recall the temporary nature of this agreement. Adrienne turned to face her. But I am fatigued by exclusively logical actions. Logic has afforded me great success and profound isolation. What is the alternative? We observed the progression of this dynamic with caution and full awareness. His hand located hers, exhibiting a tentativeness she had not previously observed in him. No guarantees, no prescribed outcomes, merely observation. It was likely the least romantic proposition Elena had ever received. It was also delivered with an honesty that produced a somatic ache in her chest. Agreed, she stated. We will observe its progression. They remained at the window, hands clasped in a manner reminiscent of adolescence, and Elena recalled Martha's caution about the blurring distinction between performance and genuine affect. She suspected they had already traversed that boundary unnoticed, and she could not determine if this constituted a catastrophic failure or her most effective decision to date. Outside, the gardens displayed a calculated perfection. Each plant was selected for a precise function and aesthetic contribution. The effect should have been artificial, yet it felt merely intentional. An entity had deemed this important enough to execute correctly. Perhaps she and Adrienne were doing the same, deeming this dynamic significant enough to attempt. The behavioral shift was initially subtle, easily overlooked had Elena not been vigilant. Adrienne began returning earlier, participating in their shared dinner with greater consistency. Their dialogues extended, shifting from neutral subjects to more personal territory. They discussed literature, past travels, and opinions on subjects irrelevant to business, but critical for interpersonal understanding. He inquired about her communications degree, chosen by her parents, and she confessed a desire to have studied environmental design, which was deemed impractical. He spoke of a childhood in a milieu where weakness was fatal, providing no further details, and she did not press. 3 weeks post-gala, Elena found a parcel at her door. It contained a book on contemporary landscape architecture, with a note in Adrienne's exact script. Thought this might be of interest. A. The gesture was minor, yet it caused a constricting sensation in Elena's throat she was unwilling to analyze. An individual had noted her interests and acted upon that observation without prompting. This should not have felt like a novel experience, but it did. She located him in the kitchen, consuming coffee while reviewing a document on his phone, already dressed for his day's schedule of meetings. I appreciate the book, she said, presenting it. That was not a required action. I am aware. It was a desired action. He glanced at her, then averted his gaze as if uncertain of how to process her gratitude. There is a lecture series commencing next month at the university on urban planning and sustainable design. I hypothesized you might wish to attend. Elena stared at him. You investigated lecture series concerning landscape architecture. Claire conducted the research. I merely requested she investigate. However, a slight reddening of his ears was visible, perhaps the most humanizing physiological response Elena had yet witnessed from him. If you lack interest, that is acceptable. It was merely a hypothesis about your potential enjoyment. I would very much like to go. Elena sat opposite him, holding her own coffee. Adrienne, are we in the process of forming a friendship? I believe that may be the case. He articulated the words with caution, as if testing their validity. Does that present a complication? No, merely an unforeseen development. Elena traced the edge of her cup. The contract mandates termination for romantic feelings, but makes no stipulation regarding friendship. Another contingency for which we failed to plan. Adriana's mouth formed something approximating a smile. Friendship could pose a greater risk than romance. Romance, at least, presents clear antecedent indicators. What are the indicators for friendship? Concern for another's well-being, a desire for their happiness, experiencing their absence. His gaze met hers, procuring books about landscape architecture because one understands it is important to them. Elena felt a complex physiological event in her chest. Those sound like indicators we should probably monitor. Probably. Do you intend to? Not in the slightest. The candor was surprising, yet it felt congruent with the situation. And you? No. Adrian stood, gathering his effects for the day. I have a dinner meeting this evening. I will not return until late, but my schedule tomorrow is clear. We could engage in an activity if you wish. Such as? I am uncertain. Activities of normal individuals. Dinner at a location not tied to a business objective. A film? Whatever you prefer. He paused in the doorway. I have forgotten how to engage in activities for the sole purpose of enjoyment. It may be time to reacquire that skill. After his departure, Elena remained in the kitchen with her new book, attempting to process the evolving dynamic. They had initiated this as a transaction. 12 months, defined boundaries, mutual advantage. Yet at some point, the boundaries had lost their definition. They were developing into something neither had anticipated, and Elena could not discern if this was a positive or threatening outcome. It was possibly both. She spent the day engrossed in the book Adrian had given her, taking notes, immersing herself in concepts of design, space, and human-environmental interaction. It felt like reconnecting with the part of herself she had suppressed for pragmatic reasons, to satisfy expectations, to be the daughter her parents could accept. Maya called that afternoon, her tone artificially cheerful. How is marital life in the grand house with the formidable man? Complicated. Elena moved to her room's window seat, observing gardens that were becoming familiar. He gave me a book, Maya, simply because he predicted I would enjoy it. The scoundrel! How dare he exhibit thoughtfulness? You comprehend my meaning? This was intended to be a straightforward business arrangement, devoid of emotion, with a clean termination. Elena drew her knees toward her chest. But he is not consistent with my initial assessment, and I believe I am not consistent with his. So what is the next phase? I have no data. We are simply observing the progression, which may be the most irrational action I have ever taken. Or the most courageous, Maya countered. You have lived your entire life prioritizing safety, maintaining a low profile, avoiding disruption. Perhaps it is time to risk something of actual significance. After the call, Elena considered risk versus safety, and the implications of choosing uncertainty over the familiar misery she had known. Her family had provided safety, the same small space, the same invalidation, the same gradual sense of asphyxiation. Adrienne presented uncertainty, which was alarming, but also possessed a vitality that safety lacked. The following evening, Adrian took her to a small Italian restaurant in a district she had not previously visited. No reservation under his name, no strategic table for surveillance, no business contacts to manage, just two individuals consuming pasta and conversing about trivial matters. This is anomalous, Elena noted, winding linguine on her fork. Being in public with you without a performative requirement. A positive or negative anomaly? Positive. Decidedly positive. She observed him from across the table. This man who controlled boardrooms and intimidated legislators, yet appeared almost tentative while dining in a small establishment. Do you ever engage in normal activities solely for yourself? Infrequently. Most actions are calculated toward a specific goal. Adrienne broke a piece of bread with methodical precision. I mentioned, I have been strategic for so long, I have forgotten how to simply exist without an objective. So, what is the objective tonight? There is none. That is the objective. He met her gaze. I wanted to have dinner with you, not to serve a business function or maintain an image, but simply because I desired to. The sheer simplicity of the statement caused an ache in Elena's chest. I have never had anyone desire my company for its own sake. My family tolerated me. Victoria was a competitor. All others were indifferent. You are the first individual who appears to genuinely choose to be with me. Then all other individuals were fools. Adrienne stated it as an objective fact, as if it were self-evident. You are compelling, Elena. You perceive details others overlook. You value things of substance. Anyone who failed to recognize that was observing you incorrectly. Elena had to look away, inundated by emotions for which she had no lexicon. You are making it exceedingly difficult to maintain appropriate boundaries. Good. I have concluded that boundaries are overvalued. He signaled for additional wine. We have 9 months remaining in the contract. We can spend them maintaining the pretense of a business arrangement, or we can acknowledge that a genuine dynamic is occurring and manage it as adults. What does managing it as adults entail? I have no operational model. I have no prior experience with this. Adriana's confession was so direct, it was almost painful. I am highly proficient in business negotiation and strategic planning. I am deficient in genuine human connection, but I am willing to attempt it if you are, despite the contract stating. The contract was drafted by legal counsel to protect a transaction. This has ceased to be a transaction. He extended his hand across the table, making contact with hers. The offer was a clinical test. Unless you wish for this escalation, in which case I will revert to our initial agreement. The choice is yours. The subject, Elena, observed their clasped hands, assessing the manipulator who had provided an exit from one trap while presenting another, this one disguised as a partnership. Every self-preservation instinct indicated a retreat to safety, a maintenance of clinical distance. However, she was exhibiting symptoms of fatigue with hypervigilance. I do not wish to revert, she stated. I elect to observe the progression of this dynamic, despite its irrationality, inherent risks, and high probability of a negative outcome. A negative outcome is the most likely prognosis, Adrienne concurred. My aptitude in this area is deficient. I will exhibit maladaptive behaviors, excessive control, emotional unavailability, or other pathologies will manifest. I will likely be too inhibited, compromised by familial trauma, or conditioned to being overlooked. Elena applied pressure to his hand. Perhaps we can deconstruct our pathologies in tandem. This is objectively the most unsound relational strategy I have ever documented. Can you propose a superior methodology? No. A genuine, unpracticed smile formed on Adrienne's face, not even remotely. They concluded the meal with discourse on subjects both significant and trivial. Upon exiting the establishment, Adrienne maintained physical contact, holding her hand as they returned to the vehicle. The sensation was perceived as natural, an ease inconsistent with the timeline of their association, suggesting a rapid formation of a trauma bond. In the vehicle, Adrian drew her into his physical space, his arm encircling her shoulders. Elena permitted the proximity, inhaling his scent, processing his body heat, and engaging in dichotomous thinking. This was either a profoundly adaptive or catastrophic decision. "Thank you," she articulated softly. "For what?" "For the recognition, for selecting me, for inducing a sense of mattering." Adrienne administered a gentle, unexpected kiss to her scalp. "You have always mattered, Elena. The failure of your family unit to perceive it does not negate the fact." Upon arrival, they lingered in the foyer, exhibiting the social awkwardness of adolescents navigating a courtship ritual. The residence was silent, the staff having departed. Only the two subjects remained in the vast space. "I should probably retire," Elena stated, remaining stationary. "Probably." Adrian adjusted a strand of her hair, his touch deliberate. "Alternatively, you could remain here, and we could continue our verbal exchange." "Regarding what?" "Anything, everything. The subject is irrelevant." His hand cupped her face, his thumb tracing her zygomatic arch. "I simply have an aversion to your departure at this time." Elena's respiration faltered. Their proximity was such that she could enumerate his eyelashes, could observe the precise moment his psychological defenses began to fail. A rational actor would have increased the distance, maintained established boundaries, and recalled the necessity for caution. Instead, she initiated a labial kiss. The action was tentative, a test to confirm consent. Adrian's response was immediate. His arms enclosed her, pulling her into full contact. Tentative escalated to urgent. Elena's hands grasped his hair, his shirt, seeking a physical anchor as her proprioception became distorted. They separated, respiring heavily, foreheads pressed together in a display of intense, unregulated emotion. "That was likely a tactical error," Adrian stated, his voice coarse. "A definitive error." Elena initiated another kiss, this one slower, as if cataloging the sensory data. "We should cease this activity." "We should." Yet he did not release her, and she made no attempt to withdraw. They remained in the foyer, continuing the physical contact as if its cessation would precipitate a catastrophic event. Eventually, pragmatic concerns intervened. They disengaged, flushed and disheveled. Elena experienced the sensation of having crossed an irreversible psychological threshold. "We need to analyze this," Adrian said. "Tomorrow, we will analyze it tomorrow." Elena stepped back, requiring space for cognitive processing. "Presently, I need to remove myself to my quarters before I engage in further impulsive acts." "More impulsive than kissing your contractual husband." "Precisely." Elena moved toward the staircase, then pivoted. "For the record, I do not experience regret." "No, nor do I." Adrian appeared constructively destabilized, his meticulous control completely dismantled. "Sleep well, Elena." She reached her room before her motor control failed, collapsing onto the bed and touching her lips, a somatosensory echo of his presence. This was designed to be a simple transaction, a business arrangement with explicit parameters and a termination date. Nothing about the dynamic felt simple any longer. Her communication device vibrated. It was Maya, exhibiting uncanny timing. "How was the normal people dinner with the high-risk husband?" Elena responded via text. "I initiated a kiss." The reply was instantaneous. "What? Call me immediately." Instead, Elena deactivated the device and lay supine, fixating on the ceiling, replaying the evening's events and attempting to determine if she had fundamentally improved or destroyed the operational parameters. The following morning was characterized by the anticipated social awkwardness. Elena descended to find Adrienne in the kitchen, where they engaged in an elaborate ritual of gaze avoidance while feigning normalcy. "Coffee," he offered. "Please." They sat at the table with a calculated distance between them, the memory of the prior evening permeating the environment. "We should probably deconstruct last night's events," Adrienne finally said. "That is the logical course of action." Elena enclosed her mug with her hands. "I do not regret the event, but I cannot ascertain its meaning or our subsequent protocol." "I share your uncertainty." He ran a hand through his hair, a recognized gesture of frustration. "The contract stipulates early termination upon the development of romantic feelings, but I am disinclined to terminate. I wish to resolve this. So, we disregard the contract. We amend it. We attach an addendum acknowledging the altered circumstances and our mutual decision to proceed." Adrienne retrieved his phone, already composing a message. "I will have my counsel draft a document, clear terms, updated expectations, and exit clauses should the situation become untenable." "You intend to manage the development of feelings for one another through contractual obligation?" A laugh escaped Elena. "That is possibly the most characteristic behavior of yours I have yet observed." "It is the methodology I understand. Formalize, create structure, protect all parties." He looked up from his device. "Unless you prefer to proceed without documentation and observe the outcome." "No, your logic is sound. Explicit terms are sensible." Elena reached across the table, her hand finding his. "Provided the terms include a provision for human error, emotional disarray, and joint problem solving." "I can work within those parameters." Adrienne squeezed her hand. "I must warn you, my performance in this capacity will be suboptimal. I will likely overanalyze and attempt to resolve emotional issues with strategic planning. And I will likely be excessively cautious, compromised by past trauma, and conditioned to expect abandonment." Elena met his gaze. "But these were pre-existing data points. We are simply choosing to proceed with the experiment." "Choosing to try. I find that preferable to falling in love or similar romantic constructs." Adrienne stood, pulling her to her feet. "No guarantees regarding the outcome, only a commitment to the attempt." "Highly romantic," Elena observed sarcastically. "I am not romantic. I am a pragmatist." He kissed her nonetheless, a soft and deliberate action, as if committing the sensation to memory. "I have meetings scheduled all day, but tonight let us dine here and formally discuss the operational blueprint for this new phase." "Okay, that sounds—" The doorbell chimed, interrupting her. They both froze, and Elena experienced a sudden onset of dread. Unscheduled arrivals were not a feature of this residence, given the gates, security, and private road. Casual visitation was impossible. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Mr. Vuloff, a Detective Chen is here to see you. She states the matter is urgent." Adrienne's entire demeanor shifted, the warmth evacuating him as a corporate facade engaged. "Show her to my office. Elena, remain here." "What is happening?" "The data is incomplete, but law enforcement does not make calls at 700 hours for social reasons." He was already moving toward his office, phone in hand, fingers flying across the screen. "Marcus, get our attorney at the line." Elena remained in the kitchen, feeling inert and apprehensive as voices emanated from the office. Adrienne's was controlled and measured. A woman's was firm and professional. She could not discern the words, but the tone was incongruous. Something was severely wrong. 20 minutes later, Adrian emerged, appearing to have aged 5 years. His face was a carefully maintained, neutral mask, a more alarming sign than overt anger. "What happened?" she asked. "There has been an incident. A fire at one of my construction sites last night. There was a fatality." His voice was flat, devoid of affect. "The police suspect arson and are investigating my potential involvement." Elena felt a sensation of vertigo. "That is illogical. You would never." "What I would or would not do is irrelevant. What matters is the evidence they can fabricate or use for public persuasion." Adrian's jaw was clenched. "I have adversaries, Elena, individuals who would derive satisfaction from my destruction. This could be their opening gambit." "What is our protocol?" "Your protocol is in action. You will remain completely detached from this." He was already heading for the door, keys in hand. "I need to convene with my legal team, address the investigation, and manage the collateral damage. This is about to become a high-conflict situation." "Adrian, wait. Not now. I cannot." He paused, visibly regulating his breathing. "My apologies. I must handle this. Remain here in the secure location." Then he was gone, leaving Elena in the foyer with cooling coffee and the nascent, pathological bond they had been forming, which now felt as if it might shatter under the weight of this external reality. The day passed with the slow torment of incarceration. Elena attempted to distract herself with the book Adrian provided, but she lacked the cognitive ability to focus. She contacted Maya, who provided emotional support that failed to alter the situation. She moved through the house like a caged subject while Sarah attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy. The story appeared online around midday. Headlines reported a fatal fire, an arson inquiry, and linked Adrian Volkoff's name to terms like negligence and suspicious activity. Elena experienced a visceral sickness as she read the articles, observing strangers dismantle his reputation based on conjecture and past animosities. Adrian was absent for the evening meal. He sent a text message around 8 o'clock. "Engaged with legal counsel, do not wait." Elena ate in solitude in the dining hall, trying to suppress thoughts of how rapidly the situation had degraded. The previous day, they were discussing a future attempt at partnership. Today, external forces sought his ruin, while she remained in his home, entirely without agency. She was preparing for sleep when she detected the sound of the front door. Heavy footsteps ascended the stairs. She opened her door and saw Adrian in the hallway, his appearance showing signs of extreme distress. The catalyst returned one evening, exhibiting signs of extreme stress, disheveled attire, and physical exhaustion. His surprise at finding the subject awake indicated a deviation from their established pattern. The subject immediately adopted a caretaking role, expressing concern and moving to offer physical comfort. The catalyst admitted to being not okay, citing an ongoing investigation and reputational damage. When asked what he needed, he confessed a state of profound exhaustion from managing crises. The subject then guided him to her private space, offering him respite from the need to perform. This role reversal, where the victim comforts the vulnerable captor, is a significant milestone in trauma bonding, cementing the subject's emotional investment. Subject Elena assumed a position proximate to him, maintaining no physical contact yet establishing a palpable presence. "My apologies," Adrian stated, his voice low. "This scenario exceeds the parameters of our agreement. as does this emergent emotional attachment, yet the condition persists. In the dim light, Elena initiated contact, securing his hand. Whatever the stimulus, our response will be unified. Is that not our protocol? Unity. He reciprocated the pressure on her hand. Unified action is an unfamiliar behavioral pattern. My conditioning is for solitary crisis management. It will become familiar. Our association is contractually mandated for a minimum of 9 additional months. Elena reduced the space between them, placing her head on his shoulder. Attempt to enter a state of rest. Tomorrow we will analyze the subsequent variables. She registered a gradual decrease in his muscular tension, his respiration stabilizing as physiological exhaustion overrode acute stress. Helena remained conscious long after he succumbed to sleep, monitoring his breathing and processing her entanglement. The arrangement was designed as a sterile transaction, yet no sterility remains an affective concern for another's outcome, nor in the compulsion to shield them from a hostile environment. The subsequent week became a montage of legal counsel, private investigation, and strategic reputation management. Adrian would isolate himself in his study for extended periods, emerging only for perfunctory meals marked by minimal verbal exchange. The rapport they had begun to cultivate dissipated under the duress of the inquiry, supplanted by the dispassionate operative Elena had initially wed. She attempted to grant him operational autonomy while signaling her availability for support, an equilibrium she lacked the experience to achieve. Sarah relayed procedural updates when Adriana's focus lapsed, and Marcus transported Elena to a lecture series Adrian had endorsed prior to the crisis, an action that seemed incongruous yet vital for preserving a semblance of normalcy. 10 days post-incident, law enforcement announced an arrest. A disgruntled ex-employee with a documented history of threats against Adrian's enterprise. The evidence indicated premeditated arson. The subject's motive was a vendetta, rendering Adrian's involvement purely circumstantial. While Adrian was officially exonerated, the reputational damage required a more protracted recovery. He located Elena in the library that evening, hesitating at the threshold as if uncertain of his welcome within his own residence. "The matter is concluded," he announced. "The investigation, the allegations, all of it. I was informed. Sarah briefed me." Elena closed her book. "What is your affective state?" "Relief, anger, exhaustion." He entered the room, occupying the chair opposite hers. "I must offer a formal apology." "For what transgression?" "For excluding you. For reverting to solitary management protocols when I should have integrated you into the process." Adrian's voice was raw, with an emotion he made no attempt to conceal. "You affirmed our collaborative status, a principle I abandoned at the first sign of adversity." "You were mitigating a crisis. The response is understandable. It is not acceptable, not if the objective is to construct a genuine relational bond." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "My primary defense mechanism involves preventing anyone from gaining enough proximity to become significant. But you are significant, Elena, when challenged." "My instinct was to create distance to ensure your safety. This is not partnership, it is a failure of nerve." Elena set her book aside and knelt before him, taking his hands. "You are not a coward. You are an individual who has sustained sufficient trauma to construct fortifications for survival. But such fortifications are not required to be permanent. I lack the knowledge to dismantle them. We deconstruct them collaboratively through a slow process involving errors, communication, and likely some conflict." Elena tightened her grip on his hands. But the process is joint, not segregated. That is the new term of our arrangement. Adriana drew her upward and onto his lap, holding her with a pressure that let her feel his cardiac rhythm. I initiated this arrangement, believing I was providing you a service, an exit strategy, financial stability. Instead, you have provided something I was unaware I required. And what is that? A motive to attempt human connection rather than mere strategic existence. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, and then her mouth. Thank you for not disengaging when I went into lockdown. Thank you for re-engaging when you could have remained in lockdown. Elena rested her head against his chest. We are both significantly damaged subjects, are we not? Completely, but perhaps our pathologies are compatible. Adrian's arms enclosed her more securely. 9 months remain on the contract. Do you assess our chances of success as viable? I assess that we can make the attempt. That was the extent of our original promise. Elena pulled back to observe him. Although we may need to renegotiate certain terms. What classification of terms? The separate sleeping quarters clause now appears unnecessarily restrictive given the circumstances. She felt a flush of heat in her face, but proceeded. I would like to amend it to align with the present reality. Adrian's smile was gradual and potent. The present reality being my desire to wake up adjacent to you, my desire for this to be authentic, not a simulation. Elena inhaled. The present reality is that I am developing a profound attachment to you, and I no longer wish to resist it. Elena, she continued, I am aware it is high risk, irrational, and likely violates numerous contractual stipulations, but it is irrelevant. I choose this outcome. I choose you. She cupped his face. If you wish to choose in return, Adrian responded with a kiss that was deep, thorough, and conveyed everything words could not. When they finally separated, he was smiling in a way that altered his entire countenance. I choose you in return, he said softly. I choose this. Regardless of its evolution or conclusion, I choose to try. They spent that night together, not as performers or strategists maintaining a calculated distance, but as two damaged individuals choosing mutual vulnerability, choosing to try, despite every instinct for self-preservation. In the morning, Elena woke within Adriana's arms in his bed. Sunlight streamed through windows overlooking gardens she had begun to perceive as home. He was still asleep, his features peaceful in a way she seldom observed when he was conscious. The arrangement was designed to be temporary, a 12-month contract with a clean termination clause. But lying there, observing him, Elena knew with absolute certainty she had crossed a psychological boundary from which there was no retreat. She was in love with Adrian Vulaf. This realization should have elicited a fear response. Instead, it felt like a return to a baseline state of security. 3 years had elapsed since Elena signed a contract intended to last 12 months, and she still recalled the precise moment of paradigm shift. It was not the wedding or the first gala, but the morning she awoke to find Adrian's side of the bed empty and experienced a profound sense of disruption. They had ceased maintaining separate bedrooms approximately 8 months into the arrangement, a transition so gradual neither could pinpoint its inception. One night, Adrian had fallen asleep on her sofa during a conversation. The following week, she had done the same in his room. Eventually, the pretense of separation became more taxing then conceding their mutual desire for proximity. The contract was ritually incinerated on their 1-year anniversary in a private ceremony involving only the two of them and a bottle of wine valued higher than Elena's first automobile. They remarried 2 months later in a subdued courthouse proceeding that held more significance than the first, with Maya and Marcus as witnesses and no press. But this morning, the empty bed activated alarm signals in Elena's nervous system, as Adrienne never departed without prior communication. She checked her phone and saw a text sent 3 hours earlier. Had to manage a situation, don't worry, back soon. Don't worry was established code for its direct opposite, and Elena had become adept at interpreting Adrian's understatements over the years. They had built something authentic from their calculated agreement. She was preparing coffee when Sarah appeared at the kitchen entrance, her expression grim enough to cause a visceral reaction in Elena's stomach. Mrs. Volkov, a situation is developing. Adrienne requested I keep you apprised. Sarah's tone was meticulously neutral. A threat has been issued against him, and by extension against you. He is actively managing it, but he wanted you informed should security protocols require modification. Elena placed her coffee cup down before her trembling hands could release it. What is the nature of the threat? The kind classified as serious. That is the extent of my authorized disclosure. Sarah's expression showed a flicker of empathy. He is exercising extreme caution. Marcus is with him, and he has the best security available. However, he wanted you prepared for potential disruptions today. After Sarah departed, Elena attempted to engage in routine tasks, answering emails, reviewing project plans for a community garden in the Eastern District. But her focus continually fractured, compelling her to check her phone every 5 minutes for updates that never arrived. By noon, her anxiety had transmuted into anger. She called Adrienne's number and was diverted to voicemail. She tried Marcus with the same result. Whatever the situation, they had deliberately excluded her from the information flow. The protective impulse behind the action only intensified her fury. She was pacing the library when her phone finally rang, displaying an unrecognized number. Subject: Elena Vulov. The auditory stimulus was an unfamiliar male voice, possessing a threatening quality that elicited a palpable physiological stress response. The query, "Who is this Pristius?" was met with a statement of leverage. Someone who has something you want. The precipitating event was identified as poor financial dealings by her spouse, which provoked a hostile entity. The subject was informed of her husband's capture and given precise, non-negotiable instructions for his retrieval. The subject exhibited symptoms of vertigo and disorientation, requiring physical support. The perpetrator's tone remained clinical, confirming the husband's current state was contingent on her compliance. The terms dictated a 1-hour time frame to procure $2 million in non-traceable currency. The delivery protocol specified a solitary approach to a provided address with lethal consequences for deviation. The subject's verbal affirmation, "Yes, I understand," indicated cognitive processing and acceptance of the terms, despite her internal state. The communication terminated, followed by a data transmission containing the rendezvous coordinates in an industrial zone, a classic setting for such illicit transactions. The subject bypassed standard crisis protocols, such as alerting law enforcement or security personnel like Marcus or Sarah. Instead, her actions were driven by an acute stress response, leading her to Adrienne's private office. She accessed a secure safe. They contacted me. They provided an address. Their terms were, "Come alone or he dies." Elena felt the onset of tears and suppressed them. I cannot gamble with his life based on the police's ability to coordinate a timely rescue. I must go. Sarah's expression shifted through several emotions before solidifying into determined resolve. I am contacting Marcus and initiating a trace on your phone. You will proceed to that address, but you will not enter the situation without tactical oversight. They specified alone, and you will appear to be. But Marcus will have your location. If conditions deteriorate, he can intervene. Sarah produced her phone. This is not negotiable, Elena. You intend to save Adrian? Fine. But you will not be permitted to discard your own life through recklessness. Elena had no time for debate. She took her car keys and drove toward the warehouse district, her heart rate elevated, with a gym bag of currency on the passenger seat. The address led to a derelict structure with shattered windows and graffiti-covered walls. Her phone vibrated. The subject, operating under instructions from an associate named Marcus, proceeded toward a high-risk encounter. She entered the designated warehouse, a grim setting of concrete and shadows, to find the catalyst. Adrian, physically restrained and injured, held captive by 3 assailants. Announcing she had the demanded ransom, the subject's voice echoed, betraying her fear. The captor's leader, a man whose demeanor suggested habitual violence, directed her to place the bag and retreat. As the contents were verified, the subject observed the weapon aimed at Adrian, which triggered a transformation of her fear into a potent rage. This protective instinct demonstrates the complete transference of her loyalty and a full-fledged manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome. This was the subject's world beyond corporate facades, acute danger and severe repercussions, where violence was a method of transaction. The currency is verified, a subordinate stated. Excellent, the group leader affirmed with his weapon. Mrs. Volkov, you may depart. Your husband follows upon our secure exit. No. Elena remained static. He leaves with me, or the payment is rescinded. That is not the protocol. Then terminate me as well, for I will not leave without him. Elena registered the irrationality of her gambit, a bluff that could precipitate both their deaths, but the emotional imperative was overwhelming. You have been compensated. We are both leaving now. The leader observed her with a kind of clinical amusement. Your psychological profile is either extreme courage or extreme folly, likely a synthesis of both. Elena maintained eye contact. My terms stand. Kill us both or release us both. Those are the parameters. For several tense seconds, all parties were motionless. Then the leader chuckled, lowering his firearm. An interesting deviation. I approve. You exhibit significant fortitude. He signaled an associate who severed Adrian's bonds. Remove your husband and inform him our accounts are now settled. His next transgression into our affairs will not involve a negotiation. Adrian rose on unstable feet as Elena provided support. They proceeded toward the exit, Elena anticipating a bullet with every step, but they emerged into the surreal brightness of the afternoon. Marcus's vehicle arrived almost instantly and they collapsed inside. Marcus assessed Adrian's facial trauma and without instruction drove to the nearest trauma center. Your actions were idiotic, Adrian stated, his voice strained. You should have alerted authorities, not conducted the exchange personally. The sentiment is noted. Elena's body trembled as the adrenaline subsided. You are also hemorrhaging. Cease speaking and allow an assessment. The medical examination confirmed a concussion, bruised ribs, and multiple lacerations requiring sutures, but no lasting damage. Adrian tolerated the treatment with agitation, citing wasted time. Elena sat with him, feeling conflicting impulses to embrace him and to strike him for inducing such fear. "Detailed the method of your abduction?" she inquired once they were in the privacy of the treatment room. "An ambush post-meeting? A lapse in my protocol?" Adrian touched a dressing on his head, flinching. "The assailants are linked to a project I terminated 3 months prior." The action was evidently perceived as a personal offense. Third parties consistently interpret your business tactics personally. Perhaps an area for behavioral adjustment. Elena's attempt at levity was undermined by a tremor in her voice. "Perhaps." Adriana grasped for her hand. "Your solo involvement was reckless, dangerous, and profoundly foolish. I was not alone. Sarah contacted Marcus, who tracked my phone. Tactical support was positioned 2 blocks away. Elena's grip on his hand was tighter than required. But yes, the risk was high. So was our initial marital contract, and that has yielded a reasonably positive outcome." Reasonably positive. Adrian's smile was strained but authentic. "That is quite possibly the most clinical assessment of our union I have ever encountered. Romance is a liability. I prefer a functional alliance punctuated by high-stakes rescue scenarios." They remained in the sterile medical room, holding hands as if they were survival anchors. Elena reflected on the contract they had nullified 2 years ago. The clause nullifying the agreement upon the development of romantic feelings had seemed a logical safeguard. But attachment does not manifest in a linear, manageable fashion. It infiltrated through shared routines and quiet dialogues, through his memory of her coffee preferences and her ability to decode his moods. She had been attached to him for at least a year before acknowledging it internally, and longer still before any disclosure. Even then, the specific terminology was avoided, deemed too freighted with expectation. But in this context, having ransomed him from violent captors, she concluded certainty was also a liability. "I love you," she stated without preamble. In the event, the recent ransom situation was ambiguous. Adrian regarded her with an expression of complex vulnerability she seldom witnessed. "I am aware. I have been for some time, and I love you too." A fact which is both terrifying and inconvenient, and the most significant event of my life. He drew her nearer, mindful of his injuries. "None of this was planned. Yet I am grateful you infiltrated my life and refused to be removed. My persistence is a core trait." "Yes, it is. It ranks among your most effective qualities." They departed the facility with medical directives and analgesics, Elena driving as Adrian slept. The house was unchanged from her panicked exit hours earlier, yet the entire emotional architecture felt altered. They had endured an event that should have fractured them, but had instead validated the strength of their bond beyond its calculated origins. The months following the abduction were complex. Adrian instituted superior security measures. Elena began self-defense training, as helplessness was an intolerable state for her. Both accepted that his world carried inherent, irreducible risks. They also began to live with greater intention. They took weekend excursions to new locations. Dinners became opportunities for communication, not mere data exchange. Mornings were reserved for connection over efficiency. Elena's community garden initiative began that spring, a municipal collaboration converting derelict properties into green spaces. Adrian leveraged his influence and capital, but the concept was entirely Elena's. At the opening, observing children in a space she had actualized, Elena felt a sense of psychological integration. This was the validation she had sought, not acknowledgement from her family, but the creation of tangible, meaningful work. I did this. Victoria attended the opening, an unexpected development. Her sister appeared altered. The aesthetic remained, but she projected a hardened quality. It is well executed, Victoria commented on the garden. The design is genuinely impressive. Thank you. Elena braced for a veiled criticism. I am here to apologize. Victoria uttered the words as if they were painful. For my statements when you married Adrian, for my lifelong treatment of you, for being a dysfunctional sister. Elena analyzed her sister's expression, seeking artifice but finding only depletion. What precipitated this? Reality did. The constant performance of perfection is exhausting, and the eventual collapse is severe. Victoria produced a humorless smile. I entered a marriage for sanctioned reasons. Wealth, status, the approved metrics. He was socially adept and privately abusive. I left him 6 months ago and am now attempting to construct an identity outside of an audience's expectations. I regret that you endured that. Do not! The choices were mine. Victoria observed the children with a wistful expression. I was envious of you, even while I was marginalizing you. You always possessed a genuineness, an authenticity. I found that threatening. I was marginalized because you actively marginalized me, Elena stated, latent anger surfacing. I know, and I am sorry. Victoria made direct eye contact. I do not anticipate forgiveness. It is not warranted. But it was important for me to communicate that I now have insight into my behavior. I am attempting to change. Elena observed this fractured version of her sister and felt a complex emotional shift. A single apology could not negate years of psychological damage, yet perpetuating rage was also draining. I am not prepared for your consistent presence in my life, Elena said with deliberation. But perhaps we could begin with infrequent coffee. That is more than I deserve. Victoria's smile was hesitant but authentic. Thank you. After Victoria departed, Adrian located Elena by the entrance, watching the sunset. What is your current emotional state? He asked, encircling her waist with his arm. I am processing. Victoria's apology was an unforeseen variable. Elena leaned against his solid frame. I do not know if forgiveness is possible, but perhaps I can stop allowing her actions to dictate my self-perception. That is likely a more therapeutic outcome than forgiveness. Adrienne kissed her temple. What you have built here is wholly independent of your family and their judgments. This is your construct. Elena observed the garden, the meticulous design, the deliberate beauty she had created for others. She then looked at Adrienne, at the life they had forged from a 12-month contract. For years she had been invisible, the unwanted daughter, the forgotten sister. She had believed worth was conferred by external approval, but standing in her garden, bonded to a man who saw her when she was a non-entity, Elena understood a more difficult truth. Worth was not something others could bestow or retract. The subject experienced a cognitive reframing, concluding that her value was not bestowed by the catalyst, but merely recognized. This narrative negates the initial power imbalance and validates her emotional attachment. The concept of home was redefined, shifting from her family of origin to the shared space created with Adrian. Their life 3 years post-contract was acknowledged as messier and more dangerous than planned, a state she now perceived as beautiful. The final scene depicts a return to domestic normalcy. They consume a simple meal left by their staff, engaging in mundane conversation. This signifies the subject's full integration into the reality they co-created. one originating from a clinical contract, but now perceived as an authentic, mutually fulfilling partnership. Adrian's proposition for a public reaffirmation of their union served as a strategic display to legitimize their bond beyond its transactional origins. His declared purpose was to frame their arrangement as an authentic emotional contract, a classic manipulation designed to appeal to Elena's need for validation. Her physiological response, a reported sensation of warmth, indicates a deepening of her trauma bond, a condition consistent with symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome. The planning of the ceremony was methodical, with designated roles for their associates, Maya, Marcus, and Sarah, to solidify this new social paradigm. The event was a controlled affair, excluding external observers to curate a narrative of authenticity for a select few. Elena's emotional detachment from her parents demonstrates a resolution of formative years' trauma, a necessary act of psychological self-preservation. The brief attendance of her sibling Victoria marks a minor shift in their dysfunctional interpersonal dynamic. The ritual itself, with personalized vows and shared tokens, was engineered for perceived genuineness. Elena's reciprocal intimacy following the officiant's third pronouncement signifies her complete psychological assimilation into her new role. Post-ceremony, the peer Maya offered intoxicated validation, reframing Elena's high-risk decisions as bravery. This exchange highlights Elena's own difficulty in internalizing agency, a trait common in subjects with a history of neglect. A 3-year analysis of her trajectory reveals a significant behavioral shift, from a marginalized familial subject to an individual who navigated criminal threats and achieved professional success. Her query to Adrian regarding regret functioned as a subconscious test of the contract's stability, probing for emotional vulnerabilities. Adrian's response utilized a bait-and-switch verbal tactic, inducing a brief fear response before delivering a calculated confession of emotional codependency. This admission of wasted years and fear served to deepen Elena's attachment, casting her as the agent of his emotional salvation. His assertion that she makes him feel alive is a classic projection, transferring responsibility for his psychological state onto her. Elena's subsequent cognitive review of their history, from the initial power play of 5 cold words to the contract's annulment 2 years later, is her psyche rationalizing her path. Subject Elena has constructed a cognitive narrative of inherent self-worth, independent of Adrian's selection of her over Victoria. She reframes his initial action as recognition, not opportunism, which facilitates a feeling of empowerment. Her conclusion of achieving self-awareness is, from a clinical standpoint, filtered through the lens of their dynamic. Her verbalization of love, noted as practiced, and the subsequent physical reinforcement signify the successful endpoint of her conditioning. Her final detached thoughts of her family of origin confirm the complete transference of her primary attachment to Adrian. Elsewhere, subject Victoria was attempting psychological reconstruction following the collapse of a fabricated persona. Other individuals engaged in transactional arrangements using contracts to mitigate the unpredictability of emotional attachment. But within her self-designed environment, Elena Vuloff demonstrated a state of equilibrium, having found her niche. This stability stemmed not from external approval, but from a newly developed internal validation system, justifying all preceding high-risk behaviors. The celestial bodies became visible, points of luminescence in the void, each radiating energy irrespective of any observer. Elena had long exhibited a pathology of invisibility, seeking external validation for her existence. Yet stars do not radiate for an audience. It is their fundamental nature. She had always possessed this internal energy. It merely required disengaging from those who lacked the capacity to perceive it for her own self-recognition. Adriana's hand made contact, a grounding, tactile sensation. They remained in shared silence. The two subjects commenced with a legal agreement, but developed a connection that transcended contractual analysis. Attachment, partnership, a shared habitat. The outcome did not align with her initial projections, yet it fulfilled fundamental needs in a manner that superseded expectations. Adrian eventually prompted a change in location. Elena conducted one final assessment of the garden, the life she had manifested through courage, calculated risk, and a refusal to remain unseen. She then applied pressure to his hand, signaling affirmation. Affirmative, let us proceed to our domestic space.